There are writers who entertain us, and there are writers who change us. And then, far more rarely, there are those who seem to have been granted access to chambers of the human soul that most of us scarcely know exist. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky was such a writer, a spelunker of the spirit who lowered himself into the abyssal depths of human consciousness and emerged, gasping, with revelations so profound that they continue to reverberate through our collective understanding of what it means to be human, to suffer, to hope, to fail, and to be redeemed. Imagine, if you will, a winter evening in 19th-century St. Petersburg. Snow falls silently upon the Neva River, coating the ornate bridges and grand boulevards in a mantle of white. In a modest apartment, lit by the flickering glow of candles, a man sits hunched over his writing desk. His face bears the marks of suffering, deep lines etched by illness, poverty, grief, and a consuming fire of creative intensity that refuses to be extinguished. His pen moves across the page with feverish urgency, for he writes not merely to entertain or even to enlighten, but to save souls, including, perhaps especially, his own. This is Dostoevsky at the height of his powers, crafting the novels that would come to be recognized as among the greatest achievements of human literature. But to understand the magnitude of what flows from his pen, we must recognize that Dostoevsky was far more than a novelist. He was a psychologist before psychology existed as a formal discipline, a philosopher who wrestled with the ultimate questions of existence, a spiritual seeker who plumbed the depths of both faith and doubt, and a prophet whose insights into human nature anticipated discoveries that would only be validated decades after his death. When Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, encountered Dostoevsky's work, he was moved to call him the great psychologist. High praise from the man who would reshape our understanding of the unconscious mind. Freud recognized in Dostoevsky's characters the very mechanisms of repression, projection, and internal conflict that he was only beginning to map in his consulting room in Vienna. Yet Dostoevsky had discovered these territories of the soul not through clinical observation, but through the crucible of his own suffering and the merciless honesty of his artistic vision. Friedrich Nietzsche, that fierce philosopher of the will to power, called Dostoevsky the only psychologist from whom I have anything to learn. Consider the weight of this statement from a thinker not known for humility or easy admiration. Nietzsche recognized in the Russian novelist a kindred spirit, someone who had gazed unflinchingly into the abyss of human nature and reported back what he found there, regardless of how disturbing or uncomfortable those findings might be. Albert Einstein kept a copy of the Brothers Karamazov on his desk throughout his life, turning to it again and again for wisdom that his equations could not provide. The physicist who unlocked the secrets of the cosmos found in Dostoevsky's fiction something equally fundamental, an understanding of the moral universe that governs the human heart. What makes Dostoevsky's vision so enduring, so perpetually relevant across generations and cultures? Perhaps it is because he refused to look away from any aspect of human experience. Where other writers might flinch from depicting the full depths of human cruelty, degradation, or spiritual torment, Dostoevsky pressed forward, driven by the conviction that only by confronting our darkness can we hope to find the light. Where moralists might offer easy answers and comfortable reassurances, Dostoevsky posed questions that continue to disturb and challenge us, questions about the nature of freedom, the reality of God, the meaning of suffering, and the possibility of redemption. Think of him as an explorer of the interior landscape, a cartographer of the soul's most treacherous and beautiful territories. Where other writers of his era concerned themselves with the surfaces of life, with social manners, romantic entanglements, and the material conditions of existence, Dostoevsky dove beneath these surfaces to the volcanic depths where the true dramas of human existence unfold. He understood that the most significant battles we face are not fought in the external world, but in the secret chambers of consciousness, where we struggle with our demons and angels alike. His influence flows through modern thought like an underground river, surfacing in unexpected places. Existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus drew deeply from his well, finding in his fiction the raw material for their meditations on freedom, absurdity, and authentic existence. Psychotherapists continue to assign his novels to their patients, recognizing that these fictional journeys into the human psyche can accomplish what years of analysis sometimes cannot. Theologians wrestle with his paradoxical vision of faith, a faith forged not in comfort but in doubt, not in certainty, but in the ongoing struggle to believe in a world that often seems godless. And perhaps most remarkably, ordinary readers across the globe continue to find in his pages a mirror of their own experience. The same doubts, the same temptations, the same yearnings for meaning and connection that Dostoevsky's characters experience with such intensity. For Dostoevsky does not write about exceptional beings or extraordinary circumstances. He writes about the universal human condition as it manifests in particular souls. His underground man, his gamblers, his murderers, his holy fools, these are not alien creatures but aspects of ourselves, the selves we hide even from ourselves, brought into the light of literary consciousness. Let us hold, then, this image of Dostoevsky as we begin our journey together, not merely an author of great books, but a guide into the labyrinth of the human soul, a guide who has walked these dark passages before us and left markers along the way. He offers no maps, for the territory of the soul cannot be mapped in any final way. But he offers something perhaps more valuable, the testimony of one who has been lost in the darkness and found his way toward light, not by escaping the darkness, but by learning to see within it. Chapter 1. The Prophetic Vision. Dostoevsky wrote in the mid-19th century, yet his insights anticipate with uncanny precision the psychological, social, and spiritual crises of our contemporary world. How could a man writing by candlelight in Tsarist Russia have foreseen the particular terrors and confusions of the 21st century? The answer lies in his unflinching investigation of the fundamental structures of the human psyche, structures that remain constant even as the surface conditions of life change beyond recognition. Consider, first, his prophetic understanding of the unconscious mind. Decades before Freud published his groundbreaking works on the interpretation of dreams and the structure of the psyche, Dostoevsky was depicting characters whose behavior is driven by forces they neither understand nor control. His underground man, that bitter, self-contradicting narrator of Notes from Underground, understands perfectly well that his actions are self-destructive, yet he cannot stop himself. He is driven by what he calls spite, a dark force welling up from depths he cannot fathom. He acts against his own interests, sabotages his own happiness, and then torments himself with self-recrimination, all the while recognizing the futility of his behavior yet remaining powerless to change. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what Dostoevsky intuited, that the conscious, rational mind is not the master of behavior it imagines itself to be. We now know that the vast majority of our mental processing occurs below the threshold of awareness, in neural networks shaped by evolutionary pressures and early experiences that we cannot directly access. We make decisions for reasons we do not understand, and then construct rational justifications after the fact. We are driven by desires and fears that we can barely articulate, let alone control. Dostoevsky saw all of this with terrible clarity, and he dramatized it with an intensity that clinical descriptions cannot match. Or consider his prophecy about the spiritual dangers of a world without God. In the Brothers Karamazov, the intellectual brother Ivan articulates the famous argument, if there is no God, everything is permitted. This is not a smug theological talking point in Dostoevsky's hands, but a genuine problem, a problem that the 20th century would confirm with horrifying precision. Ivan's argument does not mean that atheists cannot be moral. Many of Dostoevsky's most sympathetic characters struggle with doubt. It means, rather, that without some transcendent ground for value, morality becomes merely a human construction, subject to revision and rejection when it becomes inconvenient. The totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, both fascist and communist, demonstrated exactly what happens when human beings take it upon themselves to redefine good and evil according to their own preferences. The Holocaust, the Gulag, the killing fields of Cambodia, these are the logical consequences of a purely human-centered morality unchecked by any sense of the sacred. Dostoevsky foresaw this possibility with prophetic dread, and he dedicated much of his literary energy to exploring how individuals and societies might find their way back to a morality grounded in something more than human will. His prophecy extends to the psychological effects of modern urban life. In his depictions of St. Petersburg, that artificial city built on a swamp by imperial fiat, Dostoevsky anticipates the alienation and isolation that would become endemic in the modern world. His characters wander through fog-shrouded streets, trapped in their own skulls, unable to connect meaningfully with others despite being surrounded by millions of fellow human beings. They experience what we now call anomie, a sense of normlessness and disconnection that makes authentic living nearly impossible. Today, as we scroll through our screens in our isolated apartments, experiencing a simulation of connection while remaining fundamentally alone, Dostoevsky's vision seems more prescient than ever. He understood that modern life would create new forms of loneliness, the loneliness of the crowd, the loneliness of those who have 1,000 virtual friends, but no one to whom they can reveal their true selves. He understood that the very conditions of modern existence, its anonymity, its mobility, its dissolution of traditional communities and structures, would create a spiritual crisis of unprecedented proportions. And yet, remarkably, Dostoevsky does not counsel despair. His prophecy is not merely one of doom, but of possibility. For he also foresaw the paths by which healing might come, through suffering consciously embraced, through love that does not flinch from the beloved's darkness, through faith that persists in the face of doubt. He understood that the crisis of modernity, however terrible, might also be an opportunity for spiritual growth, a stripping away of false supports that could ultimately lead to a more genuine foundation. The essential questions. As we prepare to journey deeper into Dostoevsky's world, let us articulate the questions that will guide our exploration. These are not academic puzzles to be solved and set aside, but living questions that each of us must answer, consciously or unconsciously, in the course of our lives. Dostoevsky does not offer pat answers to these questions. He offers something more valuable, the materials from which each of us can construct our own answers. Why do we suffer, and what does our suffering mean? This is perhaps the central question of human existence, and it is certainly the question that burned most intensely in Dostoevsky's heart. He had known suffering intimately, the death of his father, his mock execution, his years in Siberian prison, the loss of his beloved daughter, the constant torment of epilepsy, the grinding poverty that shadowed much of his life. And yet he did not conclude that suffering is meaningless or that it should be avoided at all costs. Instead, he came to see suffering as potentially transformative, a crucible in which the soul might be purified and strengthened. But this is not the easy answer it might seem. Dostoevsky never sentimentalized suffering or suggested that it is always beneficial. Some suffering destroys rather than redeems. Some souls are broken by their trials rather than strengthened. The question is not whether suffering has meaning, but under what conditions it might acquire meaning. And this is precisely the question that Dostoevsky's fiction explores with unparalleled depth. How can we find authentic meaning in a world that often seems absurd? Before Camus wrote The Myth of Sisyphus, before Sartre proclaimed that existence precedes essence, Dostoevsky's underground man was articulating the absurdity of human existence with bitter eloquence. He saw that the rational, scientific worldview of his era, for all its power to explain the material world, left the fundamental questions of meaning and value unanswered. And he saw that human beings cannot live without meaning, that we will create meaning where none exists, or we will destroy ourselves in the attempt. How then can we find or create meaning in a universe that does not seem to provide any? This is not merely an intellectual problem. It is an existential crisis that afflicts millions of our contemporaries. Depression, addiction, the frantic pursuit of distraction. These are often symptoms of meaning deficit, the desperate flailing of souls that cannot find a reason to live. Dostoevsky knew this crisis from the inside, and his work offers not solutions but pathways, ways of thinking and being that can lead toward authentic meaning. What is the relationship between the individual and the collective? Dostoevsky wrote during a period of intense ideological ferment, when revolutionary movements promised to remake society according to rational principles. He was initially attracted to these movements, attracted enough to join a group that was considered dangerous by the Tsarist authorities, an involvement that would cost him nearly a decade of his life. But his time in prison and exile led him to question the foundations of revolutionary ideology, and his mature work is haunted by the tension between individual freedom and collective welfare. Can society be organized according to rational principles, or does human nature resist such ordering? What happens to the individual soul when it is subsumed into a collective movement? How can we balance the claims of justice and equality with the irreducible uniqueness of each human being? These questions were urgent in Dostoevsky's time, and they remain urgent in ours, as we struggle with political polarization, identity politics, and the ever-present temptation to sacrifice the individual for the sake of some abstract good. How do we integrate the darkness within ourselves? Long before Carl Jung articulated his theory of the shadow, Dostoevsky was exploring the dark side of the human psyche with unflinching honesty. His characters are not cardboard heroes and villains, but complex beings in whom good and evil coexist in uncomfortable proximity. His murderers experience moments of genuine tenderness. His saints struggle with temptations toward cruelty. He understood that human beings are not simply good or simply evil, but an uneasy mixture of both. And he understood that our attempts to deny or repress our darker impulses typically make them more powerful rather than less. How then can we come to terms with the darkness within us? Not by pretending it does not exist, Dostoevsky suggests, and not by indulging it without restraint. But what is the alternative? This is the question that his greatest characters, Raskolnikov, the Karamazov brothers, the heroes and anti-heroes of his entire body of work, must answer in the crucible of their own experience. What path leads to genuine wholeness and peace? Beneath all of Dostoevsky's explorations of darkness and doubt, there runs a current of hope, the conviction that human beings are capable of transformation, that redemption is possible, that wholeness can be achieved. This is not a naive optimism. It is a hope that has been tested in the fire of suffering and has emerged, if not unscathed, at least unbroken. Dostoevsky believed that there is a path toward what we might call salvation, not an easy path, not a path that bypasses suffering, but a path nonetheless. What is this path? It involves, Dostoevsky suggests, a certain kind of humility, a willingness to acknowledge our own limitations and failures. It involves love, not the sentimental love of greeting cards, but the active, suffering love that chooses to embrace the other despite their flaws. It involves faith, not the brittle certainty of the dogmatist, but the living, struggling faith that persists in the face of doubt. And it involves what Dostoevsky called active love, a practical engagement with the suffering of others that breaks down the walls of the isolated ego. To understand Dostoevsky's answers to these eternal questions, we must first journey to the moment when his own world collapsed, when the comfortable assumptions of his early life were shattered beyond repair, and he was forced to build a new foundation from the rubble. Chapter 2: The Catalyst. Historical context. To understand the man who would become one of humanity's greatest explorers of the soul, we must first understand the world that shaped him, a world that seems, from our contemporary vantage point, almost impossibly distant, yet in its essential features remains remarkably familiar. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky was born on October 30, 1821, in Moscow, in the grounds of the Mariinsky Hospital for the Poor, where his father worked as a doctor. This setting, a hospital serving the indigent and suffering, would prove strangely prophetic, for Dostoevsky would spend his life attending to the spiritual ailments of humanity, giving voice to the suffering of those whom society prefers to ignore. Picture, if you will, the Moscow of Dostoevsky's childhood. It was a city of contrasts, of gilded church domes glittering above squalid slums, of aristocratic carriages rolling past beggars shivering in the streets. The Kremlin walls enclosed a world of Byzantine splendor, while beyond those walls stretched a vast empire of peasants living in conditions that had scarcely changed since the Middle Ages. Russia was a land of extremes, extreme wealth and extreme poverty, extreme beauty and extreme cruelty, extreme piety and extreme corruption. These extremes would become the raw material of Dostoevsky's art. His father, Mikhail Andreevich Dostoevsky, was a complex figure, a man who had risen from humble origins through education and hard work, but who was marked by the insecurities and resentments of his class position. He was stern, demanding, and increasingly given to dark moods and excessive drinking as the years passed. Yet he valued education and insisted that his children receive the classical training that had enabled his own rise. Fyodor and his older brother Mikhail were tutored in Latin, French, and mathematics. They read the Russian classics and the great works of European literature that were transforming the cultural landscape of their era. The Dostoevsky household was not wealthy, but it was not poor either. It occupied that precarious middle ground where respectability was maintained through constant effort and anxiety. The family lived in the hospital grounds, surrounded by the suffering and death of the poor, and this proximity to human misery surely left its mark on the sensitive young Fyodor. He would later recall the hospital chapel, where services were held for the dying, and the haunting beauty of the liturgical music that accompanied so many souls on their final journey. His mother, Maria Fyodorovna, was by all accounts a gentle, loving presence, a counterbalance to his father's severity. She died of tuberculosis when Fyodor was 15, and this loss opened a wound that would never fully heal. Throughout his life, Dostoevsky would return to images of the loving, suffering mother, a figure who represented for him the redemptive power of selfless love. The death of his mother was followed, just 2 years later, by the death of Alexander Pushkin, Russia's greatest poet and the idol of the young Dostoevsky's literary imagination. Pushkin's death was felt as a national tragedy, and for Fyodor it was also a personal one. He wore mourning clothes and reportedly told his brother that if they had not already been in mourning for their mother, he would have mourned for Pushkin anyway. In Pushkin, the young Dostoevsky saw the possibility of a life devoted to literature, to the exploration of the Russian soul through the medium of art. The Russia of Dostoevsky's youth was a land caught between worlds. On one side stood the ancient traditions of Orthodox Christianity, with its mystical piety, its veneration of saints and icons, its vision of Holy Russia as the bearer of a spiritual mission to humanity. On the other side pressed the ideas of the European Enlightenment: reason, progress, individual rights, scientific materialism. The educated class was torn between these worldviews, and this tension would become one of the central themes of Dostoevsky's fiction. The intellectual climate was one of intense ferment. Young Russians devoured the works of French socialists like Fourier and Saint-Simon, who promised that society could be reorganized according to rational principles, eliminating poverty, injustice, and human suffering. German philosophers like Hegel offered grand narratives of historical progress, suggesting that history was moving toward some final synthesis in which all contradictions would be resolved. For idealistic young people chafing under the repressive autocracy of Tsar Nicholas I, these ideas offered hope that the suffering of the present would give way to a transformed future. Dostoevsky, as a young man, was drawn into this ferment. After his mother's death, he was sent to the Academy of Military Engineering in St. Petersburg, a practical education that was supposed to prepare him for a respectable career as an officer. But his heart was not in engineering, it was in literature. He read voraciously Balzac, George Sand, Victor Hugo, E.T.A. Hoffmann, the Gothic novelists whose tales of terror and supernatural mystery fired his imagination. And he began to write, first translations, then original works that would mark him as a major new voice in Russian literature. St. Petersburg, the city that would become the setting for most of his major novels, was itself a kind of literary creation. Built by Peter the Great on swampland drained at enormous human cost, it was an artificial city imposed on the Russian landscape by imperial will. Its grand avenues and neoclassical palaces were European imports, symbols of Russia's aspiration to join the civilized nations of the West. But beneath this European facade, the city remained profoundly Russian and profoundly troubled. The workers who had built its monuments lay buried in unmarked graves. The poverty of its slums rivaled that of any European city. St. Petersburg was a city of phantoms, of fog and rain and the long winter darkness that drove sensitive souls to the edge of madness. It was in this city, at the age of 24, that Dostoevsky published his first novel, Poor Folk. The book was an immediate sensation. The prominent critic Vissarion Belinsky hailed it as a masterpiece and pronounced Dostoevsky a genius, a verdict that spread rapidly through the literary circles of the capital. Overnight, the young engineer became a celebrated author, feted at salons, invited to contribute to the most prestigious journals. But this early triumph planted the seeds of disaster, for it was through his literary connections that Dostoevsky was drawn into the Petrushevsky Circle, a group of intellectuals who gathered on Friday evenings to discuss forbidden ideas, socialism, atheism, the reform or overthrow of the autocracy. The discussions were more philosophical than practical. These were dreamers and idealists, not hardened revolutionaries. But in the paranoid atmosphere of Nicholas I's Russia, any questioning of the established order was dangerous. In the early morning hours of April 23, 1849, the police came for Dostoevsky. He was arrested along with dozens of other members of the circle and imprisoned in the Peter and Paul fortress, that grim stronghold on the banks of the Neva that had witnessed so many political prisoners come and never leave. For 8 months, he languished in his cell, not knowing what fate awaited him, while the authorities investigated the case and decided what to do with these troublesome intellectuals. And so we come to the moment of shattering, the crucible in which the comfortable assumptions of Dostoevsky's early life would be consumed, and a new understanding would be forged in the flames of suffering. The shattering. December 22, 1849. A date that would become the hinge of Dostoevsky's entire existence, the moment when everything before became a kind of prelude to everything after. Imagine the scene with me, if you will. The sky over St. Petersburg is the color of lead, heavy with unshed snow. The temperature hovers well below freezing. A group of men, 21 of them, young intellectuals and would-be reformers, are led from the Peter and Paul fortress across the frozen Neva to Semyonovsky Square. They have been given white shirts to wear, the traditional garb of those condemned to death. They have been told nothing about what is to come. The square is surrounded by soldiers, their bayonets glittering in the dim winter light. A crowd of common people has gathered to witness the spectacle. At the center of the square stands a scaffold, and behind it, posts to which the condemned will be tied for execution by firing squad. Dostoevsky, aged 28, takes his place among his fellow prisoners. He has been in solitary confinement for 8 months. His health is already undermined, and the rigors of imprisonment have weakened him further. Yet his mind is intensely alert, taking in every detail of the scene with the hypersensitivity of one who knows he is about to die. A priest approaches with a crucifix. Each prisoner is given the opportunity to make his final confession and receive the last rites. The death sentence is read aloud. Dostoevsky and his companions are to be shot for their participation in a conspiracy against the state. The first 3 prisoners are led to the posts. Among them is one of Dostoevsky's closest friends. They are bound and hoods are placed over their heads. The soldiers raise their rifles. Dostoevsky watches, his heart pounding, his mind racing through the few minutes of life that remain to him. He will be in the next group. Time takes on a strange quality. Each second expands to contain an eternity. Dostoevsky later wrote of this experience, describing how his mind worked with supernatural clarity in those final moments. He thought of his life, of the things he had done and left undone. He thought of the novel he would never finish. He thought of the people he loved. And he thought about what it would be like to die, the cessation of consciousness, the dissolution of the self into nothingness. And then, at the last possible moment, a drum roll signals a halt. A messenger gallops into the square with a white flag, a sign of imperial mercy. The Tsar has commuted the death sentences. The prisoners will live. This was, it turned out, a calculated piece of theater, a mock execution designed to terrify the condemned men into submission while allowing the Tsar to demonstrate his power of life and death. The entire scene had been scripted in advance. The reprieve was never in doubt. But the prisoners, including Dostoevsky, had not known this. For them, the experience of approaching death was absolutely real. The psychological impact of this event cannot be overstated. One of Dostoevsky's fellow prisoners was driven permanently insane by the experience. Another later said that he had died that day, and that everything afterward was merely an afterlife of sorts. For Dostoevsky, the mock execution became a kind of death and resurrection, the death of his old self and the birth of something new. In the years that followed, he would return to this experience again and again in his writings. In The Idiot, Prince Mishkin describes a man facing the firing squad in terms that clearly draw on Dostoevsky's own experience. The condemned man watches the sunlight gleaming on the dome of a nearby church and thinks, "In 5 minutes I shall be dead, and yet I am looking at that gilded dome. I cannot imagine, I cannot even think, that in 5 minutes I shall no longer exist." This intensity of perception in the face of death, this desperate clinging to life in its final moments, became one of Dostoevsky's great themes. But the ordeal was far from over. The reprieve did not mean freedom. It meant a commutation of the death sentence to a different kind of death, a slow death by stages. Dostoevsky was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia, to be followed by compulsory military service for an indefinite period. On Christmas Eve, 1849, just 2 days after the mock execution, he was placed in chains and loaded into an open sledge for the journey east. The journey to Siberia took nearly a month. Dostoevsky traveled in the dead of winter, through temperatures that plunged to 40 degrees below zero. He was dressed inadequately for the cold. His chains bit into his flesh. At each stop along the way, he was reminded of his status as a criminal, a person outside the bounds of human society. The young literary celebrity of St. Petersburg had become a number, a unit of labor to be exploited and discarded. The prison at Omsk, where Dostoevsky would spend the next 4 years, was a place of unimaginable squalor and brutality. The prisoners, mostly common criminals rather than political offenders, were housed in barracks that were overcrowded, filthy, and infested with vermin. The work was backbreaking, loading and unloading barges on the Irtysh River, turning an enormous wheel to grind alabaster, trudging through snow to demolish old buildings. The food was barely sufficient to sustain life. Beatings were common, disease was rampant. And yet it was here, in this hell on earth, that Dostoevsky underwent his most profound transformation. The aristocrat who had never done physical labor learned to work with his hands. The intellectual who had moved in circles of refined conversation found himself living among murderers, thieves, and peasants whose rough humanity taught him more about the soul than all the books he had ever read. The socialist who had dreamed of reforming society according to rational principles discovered the depths of irrationality in human nature, and also the capacity for grace and goodness in the most unlikely places. He came to know these men, his fellow prisoners, with an intimacy that would have been impossible in his former life. There was the peasant who shared his last crust of bread with a starving comrade. There was the murderer who wept like a child when he received a letter from his mother. There was the hardened criminal who protected the weak from the predatory. Dostoevsky observed them all with the eye of a novelist, but also with the heart of a fellow sufferer. He came to see that human beings are not simply products of their social conditions, to be reformed by changing those conditions. They are mysteries, beings capable of extraordinary evil and extraordinary good, often in the same moment. It was in prison, too, that Dostoevsky's relationship with Christianity was transformed. He had lost his childhood faith in his years of European-influenced intellectualism. But in Siberia, deprived of all other books, he was allowed to keep a New Testament, a gift from the wives of the Decembrists, earlier political exiles who had come to minister to the new prisoners passing through. He read it over and over, memorizing entire passages, finding in its pages a wisdom that spoke directly to his condition. The Christ he found in those pages was not the figure of comfortable Sunday worship, but a suffering servant who had experienced the depths of human agony and triumphed over them through love. This is not to say that Dostoevsky emerged from prison as a simple believer. His faith, as he would later describe it, had passed through the great furnace of doubt. It was a faith that had looked into the abyss and not looked away, a faith that acknowledged the full weight of the arguments against it and chose to believe anyway. This paradoxical faith, achieved not despite suffering but through it, would become the foundation of his mature vision. The transformation. When Dostoevsky emerged from prison in February 1854, he was a profoundly changed man. The years of hard labor had weakened his body, his epilepsy had worsened, his health was permanently impaired, but they had tempered his soul like steel in fire. The young romantic who had entered the prison gates had been burned away. In his place stood a man who had seen the worst of human nature and yet retained his faith in human possibility. But release from prison did not mean freedom. He still had to serve as a common soldier in the Imperial Army, stationed at a remote garrison on the steppes of Central Asia. For 5 more years, he endured the tedium and indignity of military service, forbidden to publish, forbidden to return to European Russia, uncertain whether he would ever be allowed to resume his literary career. These years of enforced silence were not wasted. Dostoevsky thought, observed, and planned. He lived among soldiers and settlers on the frontier, expanding his knowledge of Russian life beyond the intellectual circles of the capitals. He had an affair and then a troubled marriage with a woman named Marya Dmitrievna, a widow whose mercurial temperament and declining health would bring him more suffering than happiness. He began, tentatively, to write again, first letters to friends and family, then the memoirs that would eventually become The House of the Dead, his account of prison life. When he was finally allowed to return to St. Petersburg in 1859, a full decade after his arrest, Dostoevsky found a changed world. The repressive Tsar Nicholas I had died. His successor, Alexander II, had initiated a period of reform that included the emancipation of the serfs. The intellectual climate had shifted as well. A new generation of radicals, more extreme than the Petrushevsky circle, was pushing for revolutionary change. The philosophical debates that had seemed so urgent before Dostoevsky's exile had intensified and polarized. He threw himself back into literature with a fury of creative energy. He founded journals with his brother Mikko, First Time, then Epoch, that allowed him a platform for his ideas. He published The House of the Dead, which was hailed as a masterpiece and re-established his reputation as a major writer. He published Notes from Underground, that corrosive masterpiece that would become the founding text of existentialist literature. And he began the great novels that would cement his place among the immortals of world literature: Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, Demons, and finally the Brothers Karamazov. Each of these works drew on the insights he had gained through suffering, insights into the depths of the human psyche, the reality of evil, the possibility of redemption, and the necessity of faith. But the path of his later life was not smooth. His first wife died, as did his brother Mikhail, leaving Dostoevsky burdened with debts that he would struggle to repay for years. He fell in love with a young stenographer, Anna Grigorievna Snitkina, who would become his second wife and the great stabilizing influence of his later years. He struggled with gambling addiction, repeatedly losing everything at the roulette tables of European casinos. He experienced the devastating loss of his daughter Sonia, who died at 3 months old, a grief that never fully healed. Yet through all of this, the work continued. The words flowed from his pen with an urgency born of the knowledge that time was short. His epileptic seizures were becoming more frequent. His health was declining. He wrote as one who has a message that must be delivered before the messenger falls. And the message, crystallized through decades of suffering and reflection, was this: that human beings are free, terrifyingly free, that this freedom is both our greatest burden and our greatest gift, that we can choose evil and often do, but that we can also choose love, and that it is through suffering, consciously embraced and transmuted through faith, that we can find our way back to wholeness. This is the man we encounter in his mature works, not a simple moralist with easy answers, but a fellow sufferer who has wrestled with the deepest questions and emerged, if not with certainty, at least with hard-won wisdom. He invites us to wrestle alongside him, to enter into his world of doubt and darkness, and to discover there, as he did, the possibilities of grace. Chapter 3: The Core Framework. Define the system. Having traced the arc of Dostoevsky's life, from the sheltered childhood in Moscow to the crucible of Siberian exile to the feverish creativity of his final decades, we are now prepared to explore the central ideas that emerged from this extraordinary journey. These are not abstract philosophical concepts, but living insights distilled from the most intense forms of human experience. They constitute a comprehensive vision of what it means to be human, with all the terror and beauty that entails. The underground. Perhaps no single concept captures Dostoevsky's vision more powerfully than what we might call the underground, a term that evokes the hidden depths of the human psyche, the secret chambers where our true motives and desires lurk, often unknown even to ourselves. In his novella Notes from Underground, Dostoevsky created one of the most remarkable characters in world literature, the unnamed narrator who speaks to us from his corner, a bitter, brilliant, self-tormenting man who has withdrawn from society into a kind of voluntary exile. The underground man understands himself better than most people understand themselves. He sees through his own rationalizations and pretensions with merciless clarity. And yet this self-knowledge does not liberate him. If anything, it makes his condition worse. He is paralyzed by his own insight, unable to act because he can see the futility and self-deception in every possible action. The underground is Dostoevsky's name for the hidden dimension of consciousness, the place where we harbor our secret resentments, our shameful desires, our fears and fantasies that we dare not reveal even to those closest to us. It is the space of what psychoanalysis would later call the unconscious, though Dostoevsky's conception is richer and more dynamic than any clinical category. The underground is not merely a repository of repressed material. It is a living force, a current of psychic energy that shapes our actions in ways we only dimly perceive. Consider how often we act against our own interests, how we sabotage relationships, undermine our own success, choose suffering when happiness is within reach. The rational part of our mind cannot explain such behavior. It seems, from a purely logical standpoint, insane. But Dostoevsky understood that we are not purely rational beings. We have a deep need to assert our freedom, our autonomy, our existence as persons rather than things. And sometimes the only way to assert this freedom is through irrational acts, acts that demonstrate, if only to ourselves, that we are not merely cogs in a machine, not merely predictable units of cause and effect. The underground is also the space of authentic encounter with ourselves. In the course of ordinary life, we maintain a facade of respectability, presenting to the world and often to ourselves an image of who we think we should be. But in the underground, the masks fall away. We confront the full complexity of our nature, the mixture of generosity and spite, love and hatred, nobility and pettiness that constitutes every human soul. This confrontation is terrifying, but it is also necessary. For we cannot truly know ourselves, Dostoevsky suggests, until we have descended into the underground and faced what we find there. This is not a comfortable teaching, and Dostoevsky does not soften it. He shows us characters who are willing to embrace their underground nature, and who thereby achieve a kind of horrible authenticity, as well as characters who remain in denial about their depths and suffer accordingly. The path of wisdom, he suggests, lies neither in denying the underground nor in being consumed by it, but in acknowledging it, understanding it, and ultimately integrating it into a more complete vision of selfhood. The dialectic of freedom. At the heart of Dostoevsky's thought lies a profound and troubling insight, that human beings are radically free, and that this freedom is both our greatest gift and our greatest burden. We are not determined by our circumstances, our upbringing, or even our past choices. At every moment we stand at a crossroads. At every moment we have the power to choose. This is exhilarating. It means that transformation is always possible, that no one is beyond redemption, that the future is genuinely open. But it is also terrifying. It means that we bear responsibility for our choices, that we cannot blame our failures on external factors, that we must face the abyss of possibility with nothing to cling to. Dostoevsky explored this freedom most dramatically in the character of Raskolnikov, the protagonist of Crime and Punishment. Raskolnikov is an intelligent young man who develops a theory that certain exceptional individuals have the right to transgress ordinary moral boundaries for the sake of some greater purpose. He decides to test his theory by murdering an old pawnbroker, a louse, as he thinks of her, a useless parasite whose death would free her money for more worthy purposes. The murder is committed, but what follows is not the triumph that Raskolnikov expected, but a descent into psychological torment. Not because he fears getting caught, he has covered his tracks carefully, but because something within him rebels against what he has done. His conscience, that voice of moral awareness that he had dismissed as mere convention, rises up to accuse him. He cannot eat, cannot sleep, cannot function in ordinary life. He is driven, almost against his will, toward confession and acceptance of punishment. What Dostoevsky shows us through Raskolnikov is that freedom does not mean the absence of constraint. We are free to choose evil, but we are not free to escape the consequences of that choice within our own souls. There is a moral structure to reality that we did not create and cannot abolish, a structure that makes itself felt through conscience, through the deep unease that follows wrongdoing, through the impossibility of peace for the unrepentant soul. But Dostoevsky also shows us that freedom makes redemption possible. Raskolnikov is not condemned to remain forever in his crime. Through suffering, through the love of Sonia, a prostitute who nonetheless retains a pure heart, through accepting responsibility for what he has done, he begins the slow journey toward restoration. His freedom, which had been misused in the commission of murder, can also be exercised in the direction of repentance and renewal. The dialectic of freedom, then, is this: we are free enough to destroy ourselves, but also free enough to save ourselves. The abyss opens beneath our feet, but so does the possibility of flight. Everything depends on how we exercise this terrible gift. Suffering as transformation. If freedom is Dostoevsky's central concept, suffering is its inevitable companion. For in a world where we are free to choose, we will inevitably choose wrongly, either through ignorance or weakness or malice. And the consequence of wrong choice is suffering, both for ourselves and for others. But suffering in Dostoevsky's vision is not merely punishment. It is also opportunity, an opportunity for transformation, for growth, for the deepening of consciousness that might not be possible by any other means. Consider again the trajectory of Raskolnikov's journey. His suffering, the torment of conscience that follows his crime, is not an external penalty imposed by society or God. It is the natural consequence of having violated the moral structure of reality. It is, in a sense, his soul's way of telling him that something has gone terribly wrong. And it is precisely this suffering that drives him toward confession, toward repentance, toward the beginning of a new life. Dostoevsky was not romanticizing suffering when he portrayed it in this way. He knew, better than most, that suffering can also destroy, that it can embitter, corrupt, and finally annihilate the soul. He had seen men in prison who had been broken by their ordeals, who had emerged worse rather than better. He knew that suffering is not automatically redemptive. It becomes redemptive only when it is embraced consciously, when it is seen not as meaningless affliction but as an invitation to transformation. This is what distinguishes the characters who achieve redemption in Dostoevsky's fiction from those who do not. The redeemed are not those who have suffered less, but those who have learned to suffer rightly. They accept their suffering as their own, as something they have earned through their choices and can transmute through their choices. They do not blame others, do not seek escape through distraction or denial, do not lose themselves in bitterness. They face their suffering fully, and in so doing they find within it the seeds of grace. The living life. In Notes from Underground, the underground man rails against what he calls the living life, that vital, organic, spontaneous mode of existence that he can observe in others but cannot achieve himself. He is too conscious, too aware of his own processes, too trapped in his own head to simply live. His consciousness has become a prison rather than a liberation. The living life is Dostoevsky's term for authentic existence, existence that is not merely thought about but actually lived, not merely analyzed but actually experienced. It is the opposite of the underground man's paralyzing self-consciousness. It is characterized by spontaneity, by genuine connection with others, by engagement with the world rather than withdrawal from it. Many of Dostoevsky's most positive characters embody this living life. Sonia in Crime and Punishment, despite her degrading circumstances, lives fully and loves genuinely. Alyosha Karamazov in The Brothers Karamazov moves through the world with a kind of innocent directness that allows him to touch hearts and transform situations. Even Prince Mishkin in The Idiot, though his epilepsy gives him moments of supernatural insight, is also marked by a childlike simplicity that enables authentic encounter. What prevents us from living the living life? Primarily, Dostoevsky suggests, it is the disease of excessive intellection, the tendency to analyze and categorize our experience rather than simply experiencing it. The underground man knows everything about himself but cannot change anything. He has turned his consciousness into a spectator watching a play in which he is also supposed to be acting. He stands outside the flow of life, commenting on it, critiquing it, but never entering it. The cure for this condition is not less consciousness but different consciousness, a consciousness that is directed outward rather than inward, that is engaged with others rather than trapped in isolation, that is loving rather than merely observing. It is the consciousness of active love, which Dostoevsky considered the highest form of human existence. Active love. Love, for Dostoevsky, is not a feeling but an action. It is not passive acceptance but active engagement. It is not abstract sentiment but concrete practice. In The Brothers Karamazov, the elder Zosima, Dostoevsky's portrait of a holy man offers this teaching. Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared with love in dreams. The love we imagine, the love we fantasize about, is easy and pleasant. We picture ourselves as generous, compassionate, self-sacrificing, all without having to endure the discomfort of actually being these things. But real love, active love, requires us to love particular people with all their annoying habits, their demands on our time and energy, their failure to appreciate our sacrifices. It requires patience, persistence, and the willingness to be disappointed again and again. Active love is also the antidote to the isolation of the underground. The underground man is trapped in his own consciousness because he cannot love. He cannot love because he cannot break free from his obsessive self-concern. But active love directs our attention outward, toward others, breaking the hermetic seal of the isolated ego. When we are truly engaged in loving action, caring for a sick friend, listening to someone's troubles, performing acts of kindness without expectation of reward, we are released, at least temporarily, from the prison of self. Dostoevsky understood that this kind of love is difficult, perhaps the most difficult thing a human being can achieve. It requires the surrender of the ego, the willingness to put another's needs before our own, the acceptance that we may never receive gratitude or recognition for our efforts. It is, as Zosima says, harsh and dreadful, but it is also the path to genuine fulfillment, the way out of the underground, the doorway to the living life. Contrast with rivals. To fully appreciate Dostoevsky's vision, we must understand how it differed from the dominant ideologies of his time, ideologies that he knew intimately, having once shared them, and that he came to reject through bitter experience. Against the utilitarians. The utilitarian philosophers, following Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, held that morality could be reduced to a simple calculus. Actions are good if they promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Human beings, on this view, are essentially rational calculators of pleasure and pain, and society can be organized according to principles that maximize the former and minimize the latter. Dostoevsky found this view both naive and dangerous. Naive, because it ignored the irrational depths of human nature, the perverse pleasure we sometimes take in self-destruction, the way we often choose suffering over ease, the parts of ourselves that refuse to be reduced to a happiness-seeking machine. And dangerous, because it provided justification for the manipulation and control of human beings by those who claimed to know best what would make people happy. The underground man's rebellion against the Crystal Palace, the utopian vision of a rationally organized society, is Dostoevsky's most direct attack on utilitarian thinking. The Crystal Palace was a real building, constructed in London for the Great Exhibition of 1851, and it became a symbol for the socialist utopia that thinkers like Chernyshevsky imagined, a world of reason, order, and material plenty, where human conflict would be eliminated because all needs would be met and all behavior would be governed by rational principles. But what would it mean to live in such a world? The underground man argues that it would mean the death of freedom, the elimination of genuine choice, the reduction of human beings to ants in a perfectly designed anthill. Even if the Crystal Palace could deliver on its promises, which the underground man doubts, he would reject it on principle. He would refuse to live in a world where everything was determined, even if the determination was toward happiness. What a man needs, he declares, is independent choice, whatever that independence may cost and wherever it may lead. Against the nihilists, an even more radical challenge to traditional values emerged in the form of nihilism, the view that all values, all meaning, all purpose is illusion, and that the only honest response to this condition is to reject everything that previous generations had held sacred. The Russian nihilists of the 1860s took this position to extremes that would seem comic if they were not so dangerous. They rejected art, religion, morality, family life, and social conventions of all kinds. They proposed to rebuild society from scratch on purely scientific principles, sweeping away the accumulated wisdom of the past as so much superstitious rubbish. Young people, intoxicated by these ideas, cut their ties with parents and tradition, assuming that they could create meaning and value ex nihilo by sheer force of revolutionary will. Dostoevsky's novel Demons, also translated as The Possessed or The Devils, is his great fictional response to nihilism. Based in part on real events, the murder of a young student by a revolutionary cell, it depicts the destructive consequences of nihilist ideology when it is taken seriously and acted upon. The nihilists in the novel do not find freedom through the rejection of all values. They find only chaos, violence, and ultimately self-destruction. Having cut themselves off from all sources of meaning outside themselves, they have nothing to hold onto when the inevitable crises come. But Dostoevsky's critique of nihilism goes deeper than simply cataloging its destructive effects. He saw that nihilism, for all its pretensions to hard-headed realism, was itself a kind of faith, a negative faith, to be sure, but a faith nonetheless. The nihilist believes that values are illusions, that meaning is a human construction, that there is nothing beyond the material world. But these beliefs cannot be proven by scientific methods. They are metaphysical commitments, no less so than the beliefs they claim to replace. The nihilist, then, is not the clear-eyed realist he imagines himself to be, but a person of faith, faith in meaninglessness, faith in nothing. And this faith, Dostoevsky saw, is ultimately unsustainable. Human beings cannot live without meaning. The psyche demands purpose, direction, a reason to get up in the morning. The nihilist who claims to have rejected all meaning has not actually done so. He has merely replaced traditional sources of meaning with others that he is reluctant to acknowledge. The excitement of transgression, the pleasures of power, the intoxication of revolutionary fervor. These are poor substitutes for genuine meaning, but they are meaning nonetheless. The nihilist project collapses under the weight of its own contradictions. Against the materialists. The materialist worldview, increasingly dominant in Dostoevsky's time as in ours, holds that everything that exists is ultimately physical, that consciousness, values, meanings, even the self, are merely products of material processes, to be explained exhaustively in terms of chemistry and physics. This view was promoted by thinkers like Carl Vogt, who notoriously declared that the brain secretes thought as the liver secretes bile. Dostoevsky found this view both repugnant and absurd. Repugnant, because it reduced the grandeur of human existence to mere mechanism, eliminating all dignity and mystery from life. Absurd, because the materialist could not explain his own activity of theorizing in purely material terms. If thoughts are merely secretions, then the materialist's own thoughts are merely secretions, and why should we credit them with truth any more than we credit the bile with truth? But more importantly, Dostoevsky saw that the materialist worldview was spiritually deadening. It offered no grounds for meaning, purpose, or value. It suggested that love was merely a biochemical reaction, that conscience was merely social conditioning, that the longing for transcendence was merely a neural misfiring. And while these claims might be philosophically debatable, their practical effect was to drain life of all color and significance. Dostoevsky's fiction stands as a massive refutation of materialist reductionism. His characters are not mechanisms or bundles of biological drives. They are souls, beings capable of love and hatred, nobility and degradation, sin and redemption. They exercise genuine freedom, making choices that cannot be predicted from their circumstances. They are moved by spiritual realities, faith, hope, conscience, despair, that cannot be reduced to physical processes. To read Dostoevsky is to be reminded that we are more than matter, that our lives have meaning, that the deepest realities are invisible to the instruments of science. Chapter 4. Deep Dives into Sub-Theories. Section A. The Underground Dostoevsky's Cartography of the Shadow. And now, we descend together into the most unsettling regions of Dostoevsky's thought, into what he called the underground of the human soul, that realm beneath the surface of our civilized presentations, where the rejected, the shameful, and the terrifying aspects of our nature make their home. This is not territory for the faint of heart, and yet Dostoevsky insisted that we must venture here, that our wholeness, our redemption, our very humanity depends upon making this descent. Just as the ancient Greeks believed one must journey to Hades to retrieve wisdom, just as Dante descended through the circles of hell before ascending toward paradise, so Dostoevsky understood that the path upward begins by going down. Let us breathe together and prepare ourselves for this exploration, knowing that we undertake it not to be disturbed but to be freed, not to be frightened but to understand ourselves more deeply than ever before. The concept of the underground man emerged from Dostoevsky's own profound self-examination, from those years of solitary suffering in the Siberian prison camp, from his confrontation with the darkest specimens of humanity, and most importantly, from his unflinching examination of his own inner life. He discovered that beneath the surface of every cultivated, rational, moral human being, there lurks another self, a self that delights in spite, in irrationality, in destruction. In his devastating short novel Notes from Underground, published in 1864, Dostoevsky gave voice to this hidden dimension of human nature. The underground man speaks directly to us, as if from behind a curtain, confessing thoughts that polite society would never acknowledge. I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unattractive man, he begins. And from there proceeds to unfold a psychology so disturbingly accurate that readers often find themselves squirming with recognition. What did Dostoevsky discover in this underground? Let us examine his insights one by one, allowing each to settle into our understanding before moving to the next. The spite that proves our freedom. The underground man declares that humans will sometimes act against their own best interests, not from ignorance, not from passion, but from pure spite, from a deep need to assert their will against all rational calculation. What man wants is simply independent choice, whatever that independence may cost and wherever it may lead, he writes. This is not a defect to be corrected. It is the very signature of human freedom. Consider how this manifests in ordinary life. We have all experienced moments when someone offered us perfectly reasonable advice, advice that we knew to be sound and helpful, and yet something within us bristled at following it. We wanted to do the opposite precisely because we were told what to do. The underground man reveals this is not mere stubbornness, but a deep assertion of our autonomous will. We would rather suffer by our own choice than flourish by another's prescription. This insight cuts against the grain of all rational psychology, all systems that treat humans as creatures who naturally seek pleasure and avoid pain. Dostoevsky saw deeper. He recognized that we are creatures who value our will, our choice, our freedom, more than we value comfort, success, or even survival. We are the beings who can say no to the entire universe, who can choose suffering over submission, who can assert ourselves against the very laws of nature. In the prison camp, Dostoevsky observed this strange fact again and again. Men who had lost everything, their freedom, their dignity, their hope, would still find ways to assert their will, sometimes in terrible ways through violence or cruelty, sometimes in noble ways through defiance or sacrifice. But always the human will sought expression. It could be crushed by no external force. It could be denied by no system of rewards and punishments. The perverse pleasure in suffering. Perhaps even more disturbing is the underground man's confession that there can be a strange pleasure in suffering itself. There is enjoyment even in toothache, he declares, and goes on to explain how the sufferer's moans contain an element of voluptuousness, a dark satisfaction in dwelling upon one's own misery. This is territory that polite psychology rarely explores, and yet Dostoevsky insists we must acknowledge it. We are not simply creatures who flee from pain. We can come to cherish our wounds, to nurse our grievances, to find a perverse identity in our suffering. We can become so attached to our unhappiness that we resist all attempts at healing. Have you ever known someone who seemed to court misfortune, who sabotaged every opportunity for happiness, who pushed away love and embraced rejection. The underground man explains this pattern. Such a person has found a dark sovereignty in suffering. They have made themselves the author of their own pain, rather than the passive recipient of life's blows. This is twisted, yes, but it is also a form of freedom, a demonstration that even in misery the human will reign supreme. Dostoevsky is not celebrating this phenomenon. He is diagnosing it. He understood that before we can be healed, we must acknowledge the disease. Before we can choose the light, we must recognize why we have chosen the darkness. The underground man is not a model to emulate, but a mirror held up to our own hidden face. The impossibility of pure reason. The underground man launches his most sustained attack against the idea that reason alone can guide human life. He specifically targets the utopian thinkers of his day, the rational socialists, the materialist philosophers, who believed that once humans understood their true interests, they would naturally organize themselves into a harmonious society. You see, gentlemen, reason is an excellent thing. There's no disputing that. But reason is nothing but reason and satisfies only the rational side of man's nature, while will is a manifestation of the whole life, that is, of the whole human life including reason and all the impulses. This critique anticipates much of 20th century philosophy and psychology. Dostoevsky saw what Freud would later theorize, that the conscious, rational mind is but a small island floating on a vast ocean of unconscious drives. He saw what the existentialists would later articulate, that human beings are not calculating machines but passionate, willing, choosing creatures. He saw what behavioral economics would later demonstrate, that we consistently act against our rational self-interest in predictable and patterned ways. The underground man speaks of the Crystal Palace, a reference to the great glass exhibition hall in London that had become a symbol of rational, scientific progress. He imagines a future utopia where every human need is calculated and satisfied, where science has eliminated all suffering and uncertainty, and he recoils from this vision with horror. I, for instance, would not be in the least surprised if all of a sudden, apropos of nothing, in the midst of general prosperity, a gentleman with an ignoble, or rather with a reactionary and ironical, countenance were to arise and, putting his arms akimbo, say to us all, "I say, gentlemen, hadn't we better kick over the whole show and scatter rationalism to the winds?" This is not mere irrationalism. Dostoevsky is not saying that reason is worthless. He is saying that reason alone is insufficient, that the human soul contains dimensions that transcend rational calculation, that we are mysterious even to ourselves, and that any system that treats us as perfectly understandable, perfectly predictable, perfectly manageable creatures will inevitably fail, and will likely become tyrannical in its failure. The wound that will not heal. The underground man carries within him ancient wounds that still bleed, humiliations from childhood that he cannot forget, slights that he replays obsessively, decades after they occurred. He describes lying awake at night, still burning with resentment over insults long past, still composing the devastating replies he never had the courage to deliver. This is the psychology of the unintegrated shadow. When we are wounded, we have a choice. We can acknowledge the wound, grieve it, and allow it to heal, or we can push it underground where it festers and grows. The underground man has done the latter, and so his psyche is cluttered with undead grievances that continue to poison his present life. Dostoevsky understood that unprocessed trauma does not simply disappear. It goes underground, and from there it exerts a continuous corrosive influence. We become reactive to anything that touches our old wounds. We see threats where none exist. We push away precisely the love that might heal us. We recreate the dynamics of our original wounding again and again, compulsively returning to the scene of the crime. The path to healing, which Dostoevsky will illuminate in his later novels, begins with bringing these underground contents into consciousness, with facing the wounds directly, with grieving what was lost and forgiving what was done. But this is excruciating work, and many prefer to remain underground, nursing their resentments, savoring their spite, rather than undergo the painful process of integration. The mask and the face. The underground man is acutely aware of the gap between his public presentation and his inner reality. He knows that the face he shows the world is a carefully constructed persona, and that beneath this mask lurks a creature he both fears and, in some perverse way, cherishes. This split consciousness produces a kind of psychological vertigo. He can never simply be because he is always observing himself being. He can never act spontaneously because he is always calculating the effect of his actions. This anticipates what sociologists would later call symbolic interactionism, the theory that our very selves are constructed through our interactions with others. The underground man knows this too well. He is imprisoned in self-consciousness. He cannot escape the awareness that he is performing for an audience, even when he is alone. Even his confessions are performances. He admits that he is probably lying, or at least editing, even in his most sincere moments. Modern life has intensified this condition exponentially. With social media, we now curate public versions of ourselves for constant display. We compare our messy interior lives to the polished presentations of others. We become alienated from our own authentic experience as we translate everything into content for consumption. The underground man's malaise has become the common condition of contemporary humanity. And yet Dostoevsky hints at a way out. Through his later characters, through Sonya in Crime and Punishment, through Alyosha in the Brothers Karamazov, he will show us people who have escaped the prison of self-consciousness, people who can act and love and live without constantly observing themselves from outside. These are the integrated souls, the truly free. They have somehow bridged the gap between their public and private selves, not by perfecting their masks but by removing them. The collective shadow. Dostoevsky's exploration of the individual underground naturally extends to the collective realm. What is true of the individual psyche is also true of societies, nations, and civilizations. Beneath the surface of any culture, its official values, its stated ideals, its self-image, lies a shadow realm of repressed drives and denied truths. In his novel Demons, also translated as The Possessed or The Devils, Dostoevsky explored the collective shadow of revolutionary politics. He saw how idealistic movements could become demonic, how the sincere desire for justice could transform into fanaticism and violence, how the rejection of traditional values could create a void that darker forces would fill. The revolutionary characters in Demons are not merely misguided idealists. They are possessed by something that has risen from the collective underground. They speak of love for humanity while harboring contempt for actual human beings. They proclaim freedom while creating the conditions for tyranny. They seek to build a new world by destroying everything precious in the old. Dostoevsky was not a reactionary, despite what some have claimed. He knew that the old order was corrupt and unjust. He knew that change was necessary. But he saw that revolution without spiritual foundation would merely replace one form of evil with another. The shadow cannot be abolished by political means alone. It can only be integrated through the slow, difficult work of individual and collective soul-making. His predictions proved tragically accurate. The Russian Revolution of 1917, coming 3 decades after his death, would unfold almost exactly as he had foreseen. Idealistic rhetoric would mask murderous intent. The pursuit of an earthly paradise would create an earthly hell. Millions would die not despite the revolutionaries' noble ideals, but in some sense because of them. The repressed shadow of the intelligentsia would emerge and devour the nation. This is why Dostoevsky insisted that genuine transformation must begin within the individual soul, not because he was indifferent to social justice, but because he understood that external reforms without internal transformation are ultimately futile. The shadow projected outward will always find new hosts. New systems will always be corrupted by the same old evils. Only when enough individuals do the hard work of integrating their own darkness can society truly change. recognizing the underground in ourselves. How then might we recognize this underground realm in our own psyche? Dostoevsky offers us some guidance through his unflinching self-analysis. Notice when you feel a surge of spite, of resentment, of desire to hurt, not because someone has wronged you, but simply because you can. This is the voice from underground. It is telling you that something has been denied, something wants expression, something in you is in chains and longs to be free. Notice when you sabotage your own success, when you push away love, when you choose misery over happiness for no rational reason. The underground man is at work. He is asserting his sovereignty through the only means available to him. He would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven. Notice when you nurse old grievances, when you replay ancient humiliations, when you cannot let go of wrongs done to you years or decades ago. The underground contains wounds that have never been allowed to heal. They need light and air and grief before they can close. Notice when you find yourself performing for an audience even when alone, when you cannot simply be because you are always observing yourself being. The split consciousness of the underground man has taken hold. Integration requires finding moments of unself-conscious presence. Notice when you hate in others what you secretly despise in yourself, when you project your own shadow onto enemies and scapegoats. This is the underground made external. We attack in others what we cannot face in ourselves. These recognitions are not meant to generate shame or self-hatred. That would be the underground man's response, to add these insights to his already overburdened ledger of self-accusation. Rather, they are meant to generate compassion for ourselves and for all humans who share this condition. We are all underground men and women. We all contain this realm of spite and resentment and perverse will. The only question is whether we will acknowledge it and begin the process of integration, or whether we will remain imprisoned, like Dostoevsky's narrator, in the dark cellars of our own consciousness. The redemption of the shadow. But Dostoevsky does not leave us in the underground. His later novels trace the path upward, through suffering, through love, through grace. They show us that the shadow, once acknowledged, can become a source of strength rather than a prison. The very depth of our darkness can become the foundation for an equally profound light. Raskolnikov, the murderer of crime and punishment, descends into the deepest underground of human evil. He kills an old woman to prove a theory about himself, to demonstrate that he belongs to a superior class of humanity not bound by ordinary morality. And yet, through his suffering, through the love of Sonia, through his ultimate confession and acceptance of punishment, he finds his way back to the human community. His shadow is not destroyed but transformed. His capacity for evil becomes, through a mysterious alchemy, a capacity for regeneration. Dmitry Karamazov, falsely accused of murdering his father, has genuinely contemplated the crime. He has harbored murderous wishes. He has been controlled by his passions. And yet, through his suffering, he undergoes a transfiguration. In prison, he dreams of a child crying, of the suffering of innocence, and awakens to a new consciousness. We are all responsible for all, he declares. His shadow becomes the doorway to a deeper compassion. This is Dostoevsky's most profound teaching about the underground. It is not simply a problem to be solved, a disease to be cured, an enemy to be defeated. It is, mysteriously, a path. The descent into darkness is the precondition for the ascent into light. Only through suffering, as he wrote, can we become fully human. Rest now, dear listener, in this uncomfortable truth. Let it settle into your being. You contain an underground, and this is not a cause for despair. It is, paradoxically, a cause for hope, for it means that you are genuinely free, genuinely complex, genuinely capable of transformation. The path forward does not circumvent the darkness. It goes straight through. Section B. The Spiritual Dimension, Dostoevsky's Vision of the Sacred. And now we rise, from the underground depths, toward the heights of Dostoevsky's spiritual vision, for he was not merely a psychologist of the abyss. He was also, and perhaps primarily, a prophet of transcendence, a witness to the reality of the sacred in human life. The relationship between the underground and the divine is not one of simple opposition in Dostoevsky's thought. It is, rather, a mysterious unity. The same depth that contains our darkness also contains our capacity for God. The soul that plunges most deeply into the abyss is also the soul most capable of ascending to the heights. The greater the sinner, the greater the potential saint. This is the paradox that runs through all of Dostoevsky's mature work, and it distinguishes his spirituality from both conventional piety and secular moralism. He does not offer us a comfortable religion of good behavior and modest virtue. He offers us a terrifying and beautiful vision of spiritual transformation that begins in the very depths of human degradation. Let us explore this vision together, as the night deepens around us, as we settle more fully into receptive stillness. The problem of faith in the modern world. Dostoevsky lived and wrote at a moment when traditional faith was being challenged as never before. The Enlightenment had subjected religious belief to rational critique. Scientific materialism offered explanations that seemed to leave no room for God. The death of God, which Nietzsche would later proclaim, was already underway in the intellectual climate of 19th century Europe. Dostoevsky felt this crisis in his own soul. He was not one of those believers who never doubts, for whom faith comes easily and naturally. His faith was hard-won, wrestled from the jaws of despair. He wrote to a friend, "It is not as a child that I believe and confess Christ. My Hosanna is born of a furnace of doubt." This distinction is crucial. There is a faith that has never been tested, that exists because its possessor has simply never encountered serious alternatives. And there is a faith that has passed through the fire of doubt, that has confronted the strongest arguments against belief and emerged transformed but intact. Dostoevsky's faith was of the second kind. And this is why it speaks so powerfully to modern people who find naive belief impossible. He understood that we cannot simply return to pre-modern certainty. The questions have been asked. They cannot be unasked. The doubts have been raised. They cannot be erased. And so faith in the modern age must be a different kind of faith, not the faith of ignorance but the faith of knowledge, not the faith that avoids the abyss but the faith that has descended into it and returned. In the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky puts the strongest possible arguments against religious belief into the mouth of Ivan Karamazov. Ivan's rebellion against God is not based on philosophical abstraction, but on the concrete reality of innocent suffering. He tells his brother Alyosha stories of children tortured and killed, of a general who has a child torn apart by dogs for accidentally injuring one of them, of parents who lock their daughter in a freezing outhouse all night, while she cries out to "dear kind God" for protection that never comes. "I don't want harmony," Ivan declares. "From love for humanity, I don't want it. I would rather be left with the unavenged suffering. I would rather remain with my unavenged suffering and unsatisfied indignation, even if I were wrong. Besides, too high a price is asked for harmony. It's beyond our means to pay so much to enter on it. And so I hasten to give back my entrance ticket." This is the problem of theodicy, how to reconcile a good and all-powerful God with the existence of terrible suffering, posed with unprecedented force. Dostoevsky does not offer easy answers. He does not trivialize Ivan's objection with glib assurances that suffering has a purpose or that it will all be made right in heaven. He lets the objection stand in all its devastating power. And then, through the figure of Father Zosima and his disciple Alyosha, he offers not an intellectual refutation but an existential response, not an argument but a way of being, not theodicy but sanctity. The saint as answer. Father Zosima, the elder monk who serves as Alyosha's spiritual guide, does not argue with the problem of evil. He embodies an alternative. His life is a continuous response to suffering, not a denial of it, but a transformation of its meaning through love. Zosima teaches that we are all responsible for all, that the suffering of any being is somehow our suffering, that the proper response to evil is not rebellion against God but deeper solidarity with creation. Love all God's creation, the whole and every grain of sand in it. Love every leaf, every ray of God's light. Love the animals, love the plants, love everything. If you love everything, you will perceive the divine mystery in things. This is not sentimentality. Zosima has seen evil. He has witnessed the cruelty of which humans are capable. He knows the darkness of the human heart from his own pre-monastic life as a soldier and a duelist. His love is not naive but hard won, the product of a lifetime of spiritual practice and self-examination. Dostoevsky understood that some truths cannot be conveyed through argument alone. They can only be shown through lived example. The existence of genuine saints, people who have been transformed by grace into vessels of love, is itself a kind of evidence, not logical proof, but testimony. The saint does not refute Ivan's objection, but neither is Ivan's objection the final word. The kiss of Christ. In Ivan's famous Legend of the Grand Inquisitor, which he recites to Alyosha, Christ returns to earth during the Spanish Inquisition. He performs miracles, draws crowds, and is promptly arrested by the Inquisitor himself. In prison, the Inquisitor explains to the silent Christ why he was wrong to reject the 3 temptations in the wilderness, why humanity needs miracle, mystery, and authority rather than the terrible freedom Christ offered, why the Church has been right to take power in his name and spare humanity the burden of genuine faith. Christ does not answer with words. Instead, when the Inquisitor finishes his long monologue, Christ steps forward and kisses him on the lips. This kiss has been interpreted in many ways. Some see it as a gesture of forgiveness, others as a silent refutation, others as an affirmation that the Inquisitor, despite his apparent atheism, is also somehow doing God's work. The ambiguity is deliberate. Dostoevsky refuses to reduce the mystery of faith to propositional clarity. What is clear is that Christ's response is not argument but action, not words but presence, not refutation but love. This is Dostoevsky's model of authentic faith in a skeptical age. It does not win debates, it transforms persons. It does not prove God's existence, it manifests God's character. And remarkably, even the bitter old Inquisitor is shaken. The kiss glows in his heart, though he will not change his ways. Something has been communicated that transcends all his carefully constructed arguments. The encounter with genuine holiness leaves no one unchanged. Beauty will save the world. One of Dostoevsky's most quoted and most misunderstood statements is Prince Myshkin's declaration in The Idiot that beauty will save the world. This is often taken as a pious platitude about the power of art or nature. But for Dostoevsky, it had a much more profound meaning. The beauty that saves is not mere aesthetic pleasure. It is the beauty of holiness, the beauty of a soul transparent to the divine, the beauty that radiates from genuine goodness. When Myshkin speaks of beauty, he is speaking of an ontological reality, the actual structure of being as created by God, and of those human beings who have become windows through which that beauty shines. Dostoevsky believed that the image of Christ was the supreme instance of this saving beauty. Christ is not merely a moral teacher or a spiritual guide. He is the perfect image of what human beings were created to be. To see Christ truly is to see the beauty that lies at the heart of existence. And this vision, once glimpsed, transforms everything. This is why Dostoevsky focused so much on the experience of transcendent moments, those instants when ordinary reality becomes transparent to the sacred. He described such experiences from his own life, especially the ecstatic aura that preceded his epileptic seizures, which he believed granted him glimpses of a higher harmony. For several moments, he wrote, I felt such a happiness as is impossible in ordinary life, such joy as no one else can imagine. I felt complete harmony in myself and in the whole world, and this feeling was so strong and so sweet that for several seconds of such bliss I would give 10 years of my life, perhaps even my whole life. Whether this was genuine mystical experience or merely a neurological phenomenon is a question science cannot definitively answer. What matters is that Dostoevsky believed in the reality of such experiences, and that his characters often undergo similar moments of breakthrough, when the veil parts and the sacred becomes visible. Alyosha, after a night of doubt following Zosima's death, has such an experience while keeping vigil in the monastery. He stumbles outside, falls to the ground, and weeps with an overwhelming sense of connection to all beings. He had fallen on the earth a weak youth, but he rose up a resolute champion. Something visited his soul in that hour that he could never afterwards forget. These experiences are not escapes from the difficult realities of life. They are rather what makes endurance of those realities possible. Having glimpsed the beauty at the heart of things, the soul can bear the ugliness that so often covers it. Having tasted the harmony, it can endure the discord. Active love versus dreams of love. One of Dostoevsky's most practical spiritual teachings concerns the difference between active love and what he called dreams of love or love in dreams. In the Brothers Karamazov, a woman comes to Father Zosima in distress. She believes in the immortality of the soul but cannot prove it. Zosima advises her, try to love your neighbors actively and indefatigably. In as far as you advance in love, you will grow surer of the reality of God and of the immortality of your soul. This is the opposite of the usual approach to faith, which asks people to believe first and then act accordingly. Zosima suggests that action precedes and even creates belief. Love is not the consequence of faith, but its prerequisite. We come to know God not by thinking about God, but by loving as God loves. But then the woman confesses a troubling truth. She often dreams of living a life of heroic charity, nursing the sick, serving the poor, receiving gratitude and admiration. In her dreams, she is a saint. But when she encounters actual suffering people, with their ingratitude, their unpleasant smells, their demands, she finds herself repulsed. Zosima is not shocked by this confession. He knows it represents the common human condition. We can all love humanity in the abstract while finding actual humans irritating. We can all dream of heroic virtue while practicing petty selfishness. The solution, he suggests, is to begin with small, concrete acts of love, not waiting until we feel loving, but acting lovingly regardless of our feelings. This is what he calls active love, and he warns that it is labor and perseverance, and for some people too, perhaps a whole science. This teaching cuts against the grain of modern therapy culture, which often encourages us to honor our feelings above all. Dostoevsky's saints do something different. They choose to act lovingly even when they do not feel love. They trust that the feeling will follow the action. They know that waiting to feel good before doing good is a recipe for moral paralysis. And this has profound implications for spiritual practice. The question is not whether we feel close to God, but whether we are acting as if we believed in God. The question is not whether prayer feels meaningful, but whether we continue to pray through the dry seasons. Faith is not a feeling but a practice, and the feelings, if they come later. The suffering of God. Dostoevsky's spirituality is not one of divine impassivity. He does not imagine God as an unmoved mover, serenely indifferent to human suffering. Rather, he suggests, though never with systematic theological precision, that God somehow suffers with and in creation. Christ, of course, is the image of the suffering God. In taking on human flesh, in accepting crucifixion, he demonstrates that God is not distant from human pain, but has entered into it fully. The cross is not merely a redemptive transaction, but a revelation of divine character. God is the one who suffers for and with the creatures. This has profound implications for how we understand our own suffering. If God suffers, then suffering is not meaningless. It is not a sign of divine indifference or cruelty. It is, mysteriously, a participation in the divine life itself. The deepest suffering can become the doorway to the deepest communion. Dostoevsky does not develop this idea philosophically. He was a novelist, not a theologian, but his characters embody it. Sonia, who has prostituted herself to feed her family, becomes an icon of suffering love. Prince Mishkin, the idiot, whose epilepsy and innocence make him a perpetual sufferer, becomes a Christ figure. Alyosha, who feels the suffering of others as his own, becomes a vessel of healing presence. In these characters, we see what Dostoevsky called the man in man, the divine image that persists even in the most degraded circumstances. We see that holiness is not freedom from suffering, but a particular relationship to suffering. The saint does not escape pain, but transforms it, does not transcend the human condition, but inhabits it more fully. The Church and the World. Dostoevsky's relationship to the institutional church was complex. He venerated the monastic tradition. He saw in figures like Father Zosima the continuation of an ancient wisdom. He believed that Russia had a special mission to preserve authentic Christianity against Western secularism. At the same time, he recognized that the church could become corrupt. The Grand Inquisitor is, after all, a prince of the church, and his indictment of Christianity, that it demands more than humans can bear, that it offers freedom when people want security, is not entirely refuted in the novel. Dostoevsky seems to have believed in what he called the ecclesia, the mystical body of believers united in love, more than in any particular institutional expression of Christianity. The true church is wherever genuine love and faith are found. It may exist more fully in a prison camp than in a cathedral. It may be more present in a prostitute's self-sacrifice than in a prelate's ceremonial. This is a radical ecclesiology. It challenges any comfortable identification of the church with a particular institution or tradition, and yet it is not mere individualism. Dostoevsky knew that the spiritual life requires community, guidance, tradition. Alyosha cannot become who he is without the monastery, without Zosima, without the accumulated wisdom of the tradition. The key is that the institution must serve the spiritual reality, not the reverse. When the forms become more important than the substance, when authority exists for its own sake rather than for the sake of liberation, when the church resembles the Grand Inquisitor more than Christ, then it has betrayed its mission. Practices for the spiritual journey. What did Dostoevsky's characters actually do to deepen their spiritual lives? What practices can we extract from his fiction for our own journeys? Prayer and silence. Father Zosima emphasizes the importance of regular prayer, even when it feels empty or meaningless. Every day and whenever you can, repeat to yourself, "Lord, have mercy on all who appear before thee today." This is not prayer as emotional experience, but prayer as discipline. The feelings will follow or they won't, but the practice continues regardless. Prostrations and physical humility. The monks in Dostoevsky's world bow to each other, to guests, even to sinners. They kiss the earth. They touch their foreheads to the floor in prayer. This physical humility works on the soul from the outside in. The body teaches the spirit what it is slow to learn. Active love in small things. Rather than dreaming of heroic virtue, begin with the person in front of you, the family member who annoys you, the stranger who makes a request. Love is not a feeling but an action, and it begins with the next encounter, however humble. Confession and vulnerability. Nearly every transformative moment in Dostoevsky's novels involves confession, speaking the truth about oneself to another human being. Raskolnikov's confession to Sonia, Dmitri's confession to his interrogators, even the underground man's confession to us, his readers. There is healing power in putting the unspoken into words, in being truly known by another. Suffering consciously. When suffering comes, and it will come, the practice is not to avoid it or to be crushed by it, but to bear it consciously, to ask what it might teach, to allow it to break open the heart rather than hardening it. To love one must suffer, Zosima teaches. The path through suffering is also the path to love. Presence to beauty. Cultivate moments of receptive attention to the beauty of existence. Watch the sunset, really watch it. Listen to music that moves you to tears. Contemplate the face of a child or the grace of an animal. These are not mere aesthetic diversions. They are glimpses of the glory that underlies all things. As you rest now, dear listener, allow these practices to settle into your being like seeds planted in good soil. You need not adopt them all at once. Perhaps one speaks to you more than the others. Perhaps it will be weeks or months before you remember this moment and decide to try. The spiritual life is patient. It does not demand immediate transformation. It invites a gradual opening, a slow softening, a lifetime of incremental deepening. Section C. The social and political vision, the soul of a people. Dostoevsky was not content to explore the individual psyche in isolation. He understood that the soul is always embedded in a social and historical context, that we are shaped by the communities and nations to which we belong, that our individual redemption is inextricably linked to the fate of our people. This dimension of his thought is perhaps the most controversial. His passionate Russian nationalism, his hostility to Western liberalism, his complicated relationships with Jews, Poles, and other peoples. These aspects of his legacy are disturbing to many modern readers. And yet we must engage with them honestly, not to excuse or minimize what is problematic, but to extract what remains valuable. For Dostoevsky's insights into the psychology of crowds, the dangers of ideology, and the spiritual roots of political crisis remain profoundly relevant, even where his specific conclusions were wrong or harmful. The psychology of mass movements. In Demons, Dostoevsky offered the most penetrating analysis of revolutionary psychology ever written. Drawing on his own youthful involvement with utopian socialism and on his observation of radical movements from prison, he dissected the psychology of the ideological true believer. The revolutionaries in Demons are not merely people with wrong ideas. They are psychologically damaged individuals whose damage takes political form. Peter Verkhovensky, the manipulative leader, is a nihilist who believes in nothing except his own will to power. Shigalov, the theoretician, has reasoned his way from unlimited freedom to unlimited despotism. Kirillov is preparing to kill himself to prove that God does not exist, and that man can become God through the ultimate act of will. What unites these diverse figures is their abstraction from ordinary human life. They love humanity in theory while despising actual humans. They dream of perfect systems while ignoring the irreducible complexity of real people. They are willing to sacrifice the present generation for the sake of a future utopia that will never arrive. Dostoevsky saw that this pattern arises from a kind of spiritual sickness, a refusal to accept the limits of human existence, a grandiose fantasy of becoming God through political action. The revolutionary wants to remake the world because he cannot accept the world as it is. He wants to redeem humanity because he cannot accept his own nature. This analysis applies far beyond the specific Russian radicals Dostoevsky was satirizing. We see the same patterns in the totalitarian movements of the 20th century, in contemporary ideological fanaticism of both right and left, in any movement that sacrifices human beings on the altar of abstract principles. The antidote for Dostoevsky is not political at all. It is spiritual. Only when individuals are rooted in something deeper than ideology, in genuine love, genuine humility, genuine faith, can they resist the seduction of utopian dreams. Only when they accept the limits of their own knowledge and power can they refrain from imposing those fantasies on others. The question of freedom. Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor poses a question that remains urgently relevant. Do human beings actually want freedom, or do they prefer security, certainty, authority? The Inquisitor argues that Christ's gift of freedom was a burden too heavy for ordinary humanity. Most people cannot bear the responsibility of choosing for themselves. They want someone to tell them what to believe, what to do, how to live. And the Church, in the Inquisitor's cynical view, has mercifully provided this guidance, even though it means abandoning Christ's original vision. This is not merely a critique of the medieval Catholic Church. It is an insight into the permanent temptation of human nature. We see it today in our willingness to surrender autonomy to algorithms and experts, in our consumption of media that confirms our existing beliefs, in our attraction to authoritarian leaders who promise simple solutions to complex problems. Dostoevsky believed that genuine freedom is terrifying. It means accepting responsibility for our choices. It means living without absolute certainty. It means bearing the weight of our own existence without external support. Most people, most of the time, will flee from this burden. And yet Dostoevsky also insisted that freedom is our highest dignity. It is what makes us human rather than merely animal. It is what makes genuine love possible, since love that is coerced is not love at all. The tragedy is that we are given a gift we can barely stand to receive. The solution is not to abolish freedom, which would be to abolish our humanity, nor to pretend that freedom is easy, which would be to lie. Rather, it is to cultivate the spiritual strength that makes freedom bearable. Faith, community, tradition, these are the supports that allow us to be free without being crushed by our freedom. The soul of Russia. Dostoevsky believed that Russia had a unique spiritual mission in world history. He saw Russian orthodoxy as preserving an authentic Christianity that the West had lost. He believed that the Russian people, especially the peasants, had a special capacity for suffering, forgiveness, and faith. He hoped that Russia would ultimately unite the Slavic peoples and lead humanity toward spiritual regeneration. These ideas are deeply problematic. They fed Russian chauvinism and messianism. They were used to justify imperialism and oppression. They often descended into contempt for other peoples and cultures. And yet there is something valuable buried in this nationalism. Dostoevsky understood that human beings need particular identities, particular traditions, particular communities. We cannot live as abstract citizens of the world. We need roots, belonging, a sense of being part of something larger than ourselves. The question is whether this need for particularity can be met without demonizing the other, whether we can love our own people without hating other people's, whether tradition can be a home rather than a prison. Dostoevsky did not always model these possibilities. His writings contain passages of vicious anti-Semitism and ethnic chauvinism that cannot be explained away. These are moral failures that we must acknowledge honestly. But his best insights point toward a healthier nationalism, one rooted in love rather than hatred, in a sense of responsibility rather than superiority, in the recognition that every people has its own genius and its own mission. He saw that rootless cosmopolitanism was spiritually barren, but the alternative need not be tribal hostility. The warning about utopia. Perhaps Dostoevsky's most valuable political teaching is his warning about utopianism. Any attempt to create heaven on earth will create hell instead. Any system that promises to abolish suffering will multiply it. Any ideology that claims to have solved the human problem is lying, and dangerous in proportion to its confidence. The reason is psychological as much as political. The shadow does not disappear because we wish it away. Human nature does not change because we establish new institutions. Original sin, or whatever we wish to call our persistent tendency toward evil, will infect any system we create. This is not an argument for quietism or despair. Dostoevsky believed in working for a better world, but he insisted that this work must be grounded in humility about human nature, in awareness of our own capacity for evil, in the recognition that genuine transformation happens soul by soul, not through grand revolutionary programs. When we see the horrors of the 20th century, the tens of millions murdered in the name of perfecting humanity, we recognize the prophetic accuracy of Dostoevsky's warnings. The utopian impulse, divorced from spiritual humility, is perhaps the most dangerous force in human history. Those who are certain they are building paradise are capable of any atrocity. What we can do. If grand political solutions are dangerous, what hope is there for those who see injustice and wish to respond? Dostoevsky's answer is consistent with his entire vision. Begin with yourself. Work on your own shadow, your own transformation. Until you have confronted the evil in your own heart, you have no business trying to reform the world. Everyone is really responsible to all men for all men and for everything, Zosima teaches. But this responsibility begins with the person in front of you, not with abstract humanity. Serve in small ways. Feed the hungry person you encounter, not hunger as a global problem. Comfort the suffering individual you know, not suffering as a philosophical concept. Love the actual neighbor, not humanity as an abstraction. These small acts of love, multiplied across millions of individuals, are how the world actually changes. Preserve and transmit what is precious. Dostoevsky believed that tradition, properly understood, was not a chain but a lifeline. The wisdom of the past, the beauty of inherited culture, the accumulated insights of generations, these are treasures to be protected and passed on. In an age that worships novelty, the conservative impulse to preserve has genuine value. Bear witness. Sometimes the best we can do is to see clearly and speak truthfully, to name evil where it exists, to recognize goodness where it appears, to maintain our integrity in corrupt times. Dostoevsky himself was primarily a witness. His novels do not offer programs but testimonies, portraits of souls in crisis that illuminate the universal human condition. And wait, Dostoevsky believed that the ultimate transformation of the world would not be achieved through human effort alone. Grace works in its own time and its own ways. The kingdom comes not through violence or politics, but through the mysterious operation of the divine in human hearts. Our task is to prepare the soil, not to force the growth. As you drift now, dear listener, toward sleep's welcoming shore, let these reflections on the social and political dimension of existence settle gently into your consciousness. We are not isolated atoms but members of communities, inheritors of traditions, citizens of nations. Our individual souls are woven into the fabric of our peoples. And yet the transformation begins always with the individual heart, with your heart, with this moment of quiet receptivity. Chapter 5. Practical Application. Relationships and Everyday Life. And now, dear listener, we arrive at perhaps the most intimate dimension of our journey through Dostoevsky's wisdom. For what value has philosophy if it cannot illuminate the ordinary moments of our lives? What use is profound understanding if it cannot help us navigate the daily complexities of love, work, family, and friendship? Dostoevsky was never interested in ideas that floated above human experience like untethered clouds. His genius lay precisely in his ability to bring the most profound questions down to earth, into the kitchen and the bedroom, into the workplace and the tavern, into the quiet moments before sleep and the turbulent hours of conflict. Let us consider first how Dostoevsky's insights illuminate the mysteries of romantic love. For in no other domain of human experience do we encounter more vividly the paradoxes he spent his life exploring. The intertwining of love and hatred, the dance of submission and dominance, the strange alchemy by which intimacy can heal us and destroy us, often simultaneously. Imagine, if you will, a scenario that perhaps echoes something in your own experience. You find yourself drawn repeatedly to relationships that begin with extraordinary intensity. That sensation of having finally found your other half, the one who truly understands you. The early months are intoxicating. You feel seen, chosen, elevated. But gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, patterns emerge. Your partner begins to seem distant, critical, withholding of the very affirmation that initially drew you to them. You find yourself working harder to please them, bending your preferences to match theirs, dimming aspects of yourself that seem to displease them. The more you accommodate, the more they withdraw. The more they withdraw, the more desperately you pursue. Dostoevsky would recognize this pattern instantly. He would see in it the dynamics of the underground man, the way the ego, wounded early in life, mistakes intensity for love and creates scenarios that confirm its deepest beliefs about its own unworthiness. You are pursuing not love, Dostoevsky might say, but the resolution of an old wound. You have found someone who will replay for you the drama of your earliest rejections, giving you the opportunity, always unfulfilled, to finally prove yourself worthy. But Dostoevsky would not leave you there in the recognition of the pattern. He would point toward the path through. And that path leads, paradoxically, not toward finding the right partner who will never trigger your wounds, but toward a different relationship with your own suffering. The person who has truly reckoned with their shadow, who has descended into the underground of their own psyche and returned, no longer needs romantic relationships to complete them or validate them. They can love freely, without the desperate grasping that characterized their earlier attachments, because they have found within themselves the ground of their own being. Consider another scenario, perhaps more common and thus more insidious in its effects. You are in a long-term relationship, perhaps a marriage of many years. The initial passion has faded, as it always does, and what remains is something more ambiguous. You notice that you have developed habits of interaction that trouble you when you examine them closely. There is an edge to your voice when you speak to your partner about certain subjects. There are topics you have learned to avoid because they lead inevitably to conflict. There are resentments that have calcified over years of small disappointments, never fully addressed, never fully released. Dostoevsky would see in this the universal human tendency to avoid the suffering that comes with genuine truth-telling. It is easier in the short term to maintain a comfortable surface than to risk the rupture that might come with honesty. But Dostoevsky would also insist that this avoidance of immediate suffering creates a deeper, more chronic suffering, the suffering of inauthenticity, of living at a remove from one's own truth and from one's partner's soul. The underground man knows this pattern intimately. He is a master of strategic communication, saying not what he feels, but what he calculates will produce the desired effect. And this strategy, born of the desire to protect himself from rejection and pain, ensures that he never experiences genuine connection. He remains forever isolated, surrounded by people but truly known by none. The alternative Dostoevsky offers is not easy, but it is real. It is the willingness to speak one's truth even when that truth is painful, the courage to reveal one's needs and fears without knowing how they will be received, the vulnerability of allowing oneself to be seen in one's imperfection. This is what Dostoevsky saw in the possibility of Christian love, not a sentimental feeling, but a rigorous practice of truthfulness combined with compassion, for oneself as much as for the other. Let us turn now to the realm of family, to parent-child relationships and the intergenerational transmission of wounds and wisdom. No one in the history of literature has explored family dynamics with more unflinching honesty than Dostoevsky. The Brothers Karamazov is, at its deepest level, a meditation on the question of how fathers shape sons, and how sons must ultimately transcend their inheritance without denying it. Imagine that you are a parent, watching your child struggle with a difficulty that echoes something from your own past. Perhaps your child is being excluded by peers, or failing at something they care about, or confronting the first intimations of life's cruelty. Your immediate impulse may be to protect them, to step in, to solve the problem, to spare them the suffering you remember from your own childhood. Dostoevsky would understand this impulse, and he would also see its danger. For in our desire to protect our children from suffering, we may inadvertently teach them that suffering is something to be avoided at all costs, something that diminishes rather than deepens the soul. The parent who rushes to eliminate every obstacle teaches the child that they are not capable of facing obstacles. The parent who cannot tolerate their child's pain teaches the child that pain is intolerable. What Dostoevsky might suggest instead is a different kind of presence, being with your child in their suffering without trying to immediately fix it. This is what Father Zosima models in his relationships with those who come to him. He does not pretend that suffering has easy answers. He does not offer platitudes or solutions. He offers his presence, his witness, his willingness to share in the weight of human sorrow. And in that sharing, the suffering becomes bearable, even meaningful. Consider, too, the opposite scenario. Perhaps you are an adult child grappling with difficult feelings toward your own parents. Perhaps you carry wounds from childhood that continue to shape your relationships and your sense of self. Perhaps you oscillate between anger and guilt, between the desire to confront and the desire to maintain peace at any price. Dostoevsky would recognize this struggle. His own relationship with his father was complex and troubled, and the specter of Fyodor Karamazov suggests that he spent much of his life working through his feelings about paternal authority, paternal failure, paternal cruelty. But Dostoevsky would also insist that understanding the wounds does not mean remaining trapped by them. In the Brothers Karamazov asterisk, each son must find his own way of relating to the father's legacy. Dmitri, the most like his father in temperament, must learn to channel his passions toward love rather than destruction. Ivan, who has rejected his father intellectually, must confront the parts of his father that live on in his own coldness and contempt. Alyosha, who seems most free of his father's influence, must still acknowledge that he carries the same blood, the same potential for darkness. The path Dostoevsky illuminates is one of integration rather than rejection. You cannot become whole by amputating the parts of yourself that came from your parents. You cannot heal by pretending that your wounds do not exist or by obsessively revisiting them. The work is more subtle. It is learning to hold your entire inheritance, the gifts and the burdens alike, with a kind of clear-eyed compassion. It is forgiving your parents not by excusing what they did, but by recognizing them as human beings who were themselves wounded, themselves struggling, themselves carrying inheritances they did not choose. Let us consider now the realm of friendship, those relationships we choose rather than those into which we are born. Dostoevsky valued friendship deeply, and his novels are full of intense friendships that serve as crucibles for moral and spiritual development. The friendship between Alyosha and the schoolboys, between Raskolnikov and Razumikhin, between Ivan and Smerdyakov, that dark mirror friendship. Each illuminates something essential about how we grow through connection with others. Imagine that you have a friend who is in crisis, perhaps struggling with depression or addiction or a moral failure that has damaged their life and relationships. You want to help, but you are unsure how. Perhaps your previous attempts to help have been rebuffed or have seemed to make things worse. Perhaps you are exhausted by the ongoing demands of the friendship, uncertain whether your efforts are helping or enabling. Dostoevsky would counsel first, a kind of humility about your own capacity to save anyone. The Grand Inquisitor's error is precisely the belief that he can save humanity by managing them, by removing from them the burden of freedom. The true helper in Dostoevsky's vision does not try to manage or fix, but rather accompanies. They are present. They tell the truth. They refuse to pretend that everything is fine when it is not. But they also refuse to abandon, even when their help seems ineffective. This is difficult work. It requires the capacity to tolerate ambiguity, to accept that you cannot control another person's choices, to remain connected even when connection is painful. It is the opposite of the underground man's isolation, and it is also the opposite of the do-gooder's fantasy of rescue. It is simply being there, as one imperfect person alongside another, both of you struggling toward the light. And now let us consider the realm of work, for we spend so much of our lives in labor, and yet so rarely do we bring philosophical wisdom to bear on how we work and why. Imagine that you find yourself in a workplace characterized by petty politics, by competition rather than collaboration, by a disconnect between the stated values of the organization and its actual practices. Perhaps you have a supervisor who seems to embody everything Dostoevsky warned about: the will to power masked as concern, the manipulation that pretends to be management, the small cruelties that accumulate over time into an atmosphere of demoralization. Dostoevsky would recognize this environment. He would see in it the playing out of the same dynamics that operate at the societal level, the tendency of institutions to become vehicles for power rather than service, the corruption that comes when people are treated as means rather than ends. But he would also ask you to look inward. What part do you play in maintaining the system you decry? Where have you compromised your own integrity to survive or advance? What truths are you not speaking because the cost seems too high? This is uncomfortable territory. It is easier to identify the problem as external, as residing in the supervisor, the organization, the system. But Dostoevsky insists on the primacy of personal responsibility. Even within corrupt systems, you have choices about how you conduct yourself. You can choose to tell the truth even when lying would be easier. You can choose to treat your colleagues with respect even when the culture encourages contempt. You can choose to do your work with integrity, even when cutting corners would go unnoticed. This does not mean becoming a martyr or a fool. Dostoevsky was no naive idealist. He knew that corrupt systems often punish those who refuse to play by their rules. But he also knew that the alternative, abandoning one's integrity to survive, is a kind of death. The underground man survives, but at what cost? He has preserved his physical existence by sacrificing his soul. Perhaps there are situations where the only honest choice is to leave, to refuse participation in a system that cannot be reformed from within. Dostoevsky would not judge this choice. He would only ask that it be made clearly, with full awareness of what one is choosing, and why, rather than through the gradual drift of compromises that leaves one complicit in what one despises. In all of these scenarios, romantic love, family, friendship, work, we see the same fundamental pattern. Dostoevsky calls us away from the temptations of the underground, the fantasy of control, the avoidance of vulnerability, the retreat into theories and abstractions that protect us from the messiness of actual human connection. And he calls us toward something more difficult but more real: the willingness to suffer with and for others, the courage to speak truth even when it is costly, the faith that love, real love, not its sentimental counterfeit, has the power to transform even the most broken situations. The path to wholeness. And now, dear listener, let us turn from these specific scenarios to the more general question of how Dostoevsky understood the journey toward human wholeness. For while he did not offer a systematic method in the manner of psychotherapists or spiritual teachers, there is within his work a clear sense of the stages through which a soul must pass in its movement toward authenticity and grace. The first stage, as we have seen, is the recognition of the underground within oneself. This cannot be rushed or bypassed. So many spiritual and psychological methods promise shortcuts, techniques that will lift us above our darkness, practices that will purify us without requiring us to descend. Dostoevsky would view all such promises with suspicion. The only way out is through. What does this recognition look like in practice? It begins, perhaps, with moments of uncomfortable self-awareness. You catch yourself in a thought or feeling that contradicts your self-image. You notice the gap between what you say you value and how you actually behave. You become aware of the inner voice that comments nastily on others, that harbors petty jealousies and resentments, that takes secret pleasure in the misfortunes of those you claim to love. The temptation at this stage is to immediately try to fix what you have discovered, to stamp out the unwanted thoughts, to discipline yourself into purity. But Dostoevsky would counsel patience. The shadow is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be acknowledged. It has information to offer, if you can learn to listen to it without either indulging it or trying to destroy it. Consider keeping what we might call a shadow journal, not a record of your noble thoughts and spiritual aspirations, but an honest accounting of the less flattering aspects of your inner life. When you feel envy, write it down. When you judge another person harshly, note it. When you catch yourself fantasizing about revenge or recognition or escape from responsibility, acknowledge it. Do not try to make these observations into lessons or resolutions. Simply let them accumulate, let yourself see the patterns, let the underground become visible. This practice may feel uncomfortable at first, even dangerous, as if by writing down your shadow you are somehow strengthening it. But the opposite is true. What we refuse to acknowledge controls us. What we bring into the light of awareness loses its compulsive power. You may find, after weeks or months of this practice, that you have developed a different relationship with your own darkness, not acceptance in the sense of approval, but acceptance in the sense of recognition. This is part of you. It does not define you, but it cannot be excluded from the wholeness you seek. The second stage in Dostoevsky's implicit path involves what we might call the crisis of meaning. Once you have truly seen the underground within yourself, you can no longer maintain the comfortable illusions that previously structured your life. The meanings you took for granted, the assumption that you were basically a good person, the belief that the world was fundamentally fair, the confidence that hard work and good intentions would be rewarded, all of these begin to crumble. This is a dangerous stage. Many people encountering this collapse of meaning retreat back into unconsciousness. They close their eyes again, reassert their comfortable beliefs, convince themselves that their moment of clarity was a mistake or an illness. Others move in the opposite direction. They embrace nihilism, concluding that if their previous meanings were illusions, then all meaning is illusory. This is Ivan Karamazov's temptation, and we have seen where it leads. Dostoevsky's path requires staying in the discomfort, neither fleeing back into comfortable illusions nor rushing forward into nihilistic certainty. There is a period, perhaps a long period, where you must simply not know. You must tolerate the anxiety of groundlessness, the vertigo of having no solid floor beneath your feet. This is not pleasant, but it is necessary. The new meanings that will eventually emerge cannot be constructed on the ruins of the old ones. They must grow from a different soil entirely. During this stage, certain practices can help you maintain your balance. Dostoevsky himself found solace in the reading of scripture, particularly the Gospels and the Book of Job. You might find your own sources of grounding, texts or teachings that speak to the depths of human experience without offering premature answers. The point is not to find certainty, but to find companionship. Others have walked this path before you. Their witness can help you endure your own journey. It is also important during this stage to maintain your connections with ordinary life. There is a temptation, when one is in the midst of existential crisis, to withdraw from the mundane demands of work, relationship, and daily routine. But Dostoevsky understood that these ordinary structures are not obstacles to spiritual development. They are its context. It is easy to feel spiritually advanced when you are alone on a mountaintop. The test comes when you must return to the valley, to the irritations and compromises and small frustrations of human community. Father Zosima sends Alyosha out of the monastery and into the world. This is not a punishment or a distraction from his spiritual work. It is the work itself. Meaning is not found by escaping life, but by engaging with it more fully, more honestly, more lovingly. The third stage involves what Dostoevsky would call the encounter with active love. This is the turning point, the moment when the journey shifts from descent to ascent, from breakdown to breakthrough. And it often comes, paradoxically, not through any deliberate effort but through an unexpected encounter with the suffering of another. Alyosha's transformation comes through his engagement with the schoolboys, particularly with the dying child Ilyusha. Raskolnikov's journey toward redemption begins when he encounters Sonya, who has suffered unspeakably yet maintained her capacity for love. In each case, the encounter breaks through the isolation of the self and reveals the possibility of connection. You cannot manufacture such encounters, but you can create conditions that make them more likely. This means being willing to be present with people who are suffering, not to fix them or advise them, but simply to be with them. It means allowing yourself to be affected, to let your heart be touched, to feel the reality of another person's pain as if it were your own. This is what Dostoevsky means by active love. It is not a feeling or a sentiment. It is a practice, a discipline, a way of being in the world. And it requires, paradoxically, a kind of death, the death of the self-protective ego that wants to remain safe and separate. In allowing yourself to truly feel another's suffering, you discover that you are not alone. Your underground isolation was always an illusion. You are connected inextricably to all other human beings. The fourth stage is what Dostoevsky understands as grace, the discovery that the effort you have been making is not ultimately your own. There comes a point in the journey when you realize that you have been carried, that forces larger than your conscience will have been guiding you, that your very desire for wholeness was itself a gift. This is mysterious territory, and Dostoevsky does not pretend to fully understand it. Grace cannot be earned or achieved. It comes when it comes as pure gift. But Dostoevsky does suggest that the earlier stages of the journey, the descent into the underground, the crisis of meaning, the encounter with active love, prepare the soul to receive what it cannot manufacture. The practical implication is that you need not be discouraged by the difficulty of the path. Your effort matters, not because it produces results directly, but because it opens you to receive something beyond yourself. The gesture of reaching, even when you cannot grasp what you reach for, is itself meaningful. The fifth and final stage is what we might call integration or wholeness, though Dostoevsky would warn against imagining this as a final destination. It is more like a way of being that must be continually renewed. The person who has traversed these stages does not transcend the underground. They carry it within them, acknowledged and integrated. They do not escape suffering. They have learned to suffer meaningfully, in solidarity with all who suffer. They have not solved the problem of meaning. They have learned to live the question. What does this wholeness look like in practice? It looks like Alyosha at the end of the Brothers Karamazov asterisk, standing among the schoolboys after Ilyusha's funeral. It looks like a capacity to be fully present to grief without being destroyed by it. It looks like joy that does not deny sorrow but encompasses it. It looks like the ability to love without grasping, to hope without demanding, to act without knowing the outcome. And perhaps most importantly, it looks like simplicity. Dostoevsky's wisest characters, Father Zosima, Alyosha, Sonya, are not complicated. They are not clever or sophisticated in the way the underground man is clever. They have passed through complexity and emerged into a kind of clarity. They know what matters. They act accordingly. They are available to God, to others, to the needs of the moment. This simplicity is not naivety. It comes after, not before, the descent into the underground. It is the fruit of hard-won wisdom, not the result of having avoided the struggle. The person who has truly integrated their shadow can afford to be simple, because they are no longer hiding from themselves or from others. Self-reflection questions. As you drift towards sleep, dear listener, you might carry with you some questions, not to be answered immediately, but to be lived with, returned to over time, allowed to work their slow alchemy in the depths of your being. First, regarding your own underground, what aspects of yourself do you most resist acknowledging? When you catch a glimpse of your shadow in a moment of pettiness, jealousy, cruelty, or despair, what is your first impulse? To look away? To judge yourself? To make excuses? Can you imagine developing a different relationship with these parts of yourself? Not approval, but acknowledgement. Second, regarding suffering. When you encounter suffering, your own or another's, what is your first response? Do you try to fix it, explain it, escape it? What would it mean to simply be present with suffering without needing to do anything about it? Can you recall a time when suffering, fully faced, opened into something unexpected, a deeper connection, a new understanding, a strange kind of grace? Third, regarding freedom. In what areas of your life do you most feel the burden of freedom? Where do you most wish someone would simply tell you what to do? What decisions are you avoiding by pretending that you have no choice? What would change if you fully accepted your responsibility, for how you live your life. Fourth, regarding love. What would it look like to practice active love in your current circumstances? Is there someone in your life who is suffering to whom you could offer the gift of your presence? What barriers, fear, pride, busyness, self-protection, stand between you and this practice? Fifth, regarding meaning. What do you truly believe about the nature of existence? Not what you were taught to believe, or what you think you should believe, but what you actually believe in the depth of your being when you are most honest with yourself. And if you're not sure, if the question of meaning remains genuinely open for you, can you tolerate this uncertainty without rushing toward premature closure? Sixth, regarding your inheritance. What have you inherited from your parents, your culture, your historical moment that serves your development, and what have you inherited that hinders it? Can you hold this inheritance with gratitude and grief, accepting all of it as yours without being determined by any of it? Seventh, regarding authenticity. Where in your life are you most tempted to perform, to be what others expect rather than what you are? What would you risk if you stopped performing? What might you gain? Eighth, regarding death. How does the awareness of your mortality affect how you live? Do you think about death too much, too little, or in the wrong ways? What would it mean to let the fact of death inform your choices without paralyzing you? Ninth, regarding beauty. When was the last time you were truly moved by beauty, by a work of art, a landscape, a human gesture, a moment of unexpected grace? What happened in that moment? Was there a sense of something beyond yourself, something that you could not manufacture but only receive? Tenth, regarding hope. In the face of all you know about human darkness, your own and the world's, what sustains your hope? Is this hope based on evidence or on something else? Can you distinguish between hope and optimism, between genuine faith and wishful thinking? These questions have no final answers. They are meant to be lived with, returned to at different moments of your life. Each time you encounter them, you will be a different person, and they will reveal different dimensions. This is how Dostoevsky intended his work to function, not as a doctrine to be mastered, but as a provocation to ongoing reflection. Recognition exercises. Beyond questions, there are practices you might undertake, ways of training your attention that align with Dostoevsky's vision of human development. The first is the practice of moral attention. Set aside time each day, perhaps before sleep as you are doing now, to review your interactions with others, not to judge yourself but to see clearly. Where did you meet another person as a person, truly seeing them? Where did you use another as a means to your ends? Where were you kind and where were you cruel? Where did you tell the truth and where did you obscure it? This practice is not meant to produce guilt but awareness. Over time, you may notice patterns, situations where you consistently fall short of your own values, relationships where you habitually play certain roles. These patterns are information. They point toward the work that remains to be done. The second practice involves attention to suffering. Dostoevsky observed that we spend enormous energy avoiding awareness of the suffering around us. We walk past homeless people without seeing them. We change the channel when the news becomes too disturbing. We construct routines and environments that insulate us from the reality of human pain. The practice is simple. Resist this avoidance at least some of the time. When you encounter suffering, do not look away. Let it register. Let yourself feel the weight of it. You do not need to solve it or fix it. That is often beyond your power. But you can witness it. You can let it matter to you. This witnessing is itself a form of love. The third practice is what we might call the discipline of depth. Dostoevsky's novels are slow. They demand sustained attention. They resist the fragmented, superficial engagement that characterizes so much of modern life. The practice is to cultivate this kind of sustained, deep attention in other areas of your life. Choose something, a book, a piece of music, a relationship, a craft, and engage with it slowly over time, allowing its complexity to unfold. Resist the urge to move on once you have grasped the surface. Stay with it until you have reached the depths that only patient attention can reveal. This training in depth will gradually reshape how you encounter everything. The fourth practice involves speaking truth. Not aggressively, not as a weapon, but as an offering. Start small. Notice the small lies you tell throughout the day, the social lubricants, the protective evasions, the half-truths that seem harmless. Begin to tell the truth in these small moments. If someone asks how you are and you are not fine, say so. If you disagree with something, say so gently but clearly. If you do not know something, admit it. This practice will be uncomfortable at first. We are deeply habituated to the small deceits that smooth social interaction. But over time, you may find that speaking truth creates a different quality of relationship, deeper, more real, more trustworthy. And you may find that your inner life clarifies as well, as the gap between your public presentation and your private reality narrows. The fifth practice is the cultivation of compassion for the self. This may seem paradoxical, given Dostoevsky's emphasis on self-examination and moral responsibility. But genuine self-compassion is not indulgence. It is the foundation for any authentic transformation. When you catch yourself in failure, when the shadow emerges, when you act against your values, when you fall short of what you aspire to be, notice how you respond. Is there a voice of harsh self-condemnation? Does shame drive you toward concealment or denial? Practice, instead, speaking to yourself as you would speak to someone you love who has stumbled. Not excusing the failure, but not adding cruelty to it. This is what Dostoevsky meant when he wrote about the love that covers a multitude of sins. Working with specific life challenges. Let us consider, finally, how Dostoevsky's wisdom applies to some of the specific struggles that may visit you in the course of your life. Anxiety and fear. If you are prone to anxiety, that free-floating sense of dread, that constant vigilance against imagined threats, that inability to rest in the present moment, Dostoevsky would first counsel you to stop fighting. Anxiety, like all symptoms, carries information. It points towards something that needs attention. The attempt to eliminate anxiety through willpower or distraction only drives it underground, where it continues to exert its influence. What is your anxiety trying to protect you from? Often, beneath the surface fears of illness, of failure, of rejection, lies a deeper fear, the fear of freedom itself, the vertigo of being responsible for a life whose outcome you cannot control. Dostoevsky understood this fear intimately. It is the fear that makes the Grand Inquisitor's offer so tempting. Just tell me what to do and I will obey. The path through anxiety leads toward, not away from, this deeper fear. It means allowing yourself to fully feel the groundlessness of existence, the fact that there are no guarantees, the reality that you might fail despite your best efforts. This is terrifying, but it is also liberating. For in accepting what you cannot control, you discover what you can. Your response, your stance, your way of being with uncertainty. Practices that may help. Spend time each day simply sitting with uncertainty. Not trying to resolve it, not planning contingencies, just being with the fact that you do not know what the future holds. Let this not knowing become familiar, even comfortable. You may find that the anticipation of uncertainty is worse than the uncertainty itself. Also, orient toward what matters. Anxiety tends to expand to fill any vacuum of meaning. If you are clear about what you value and why, the inevitable uncertainties of existence become more bearable. They are part of the cost of pursuing something worthwhile. Depression and meaninglessness. If you find yourself in the grip of depression, that gray flatness, that inability to feel pleasure or connection, that weight that makes the simplest tasks seem impossible, Dostoevsky would recognize your state. Many of his characters inhabit it, and there is evidence that he experienced it himself during his darkest periods. Depression often carries a message that the conscious mind has been refusing to hear. Something in your life is not working. Some adaptation you have made, perhaps years ago, is no longer serving you. Some truth you have been avoiding is demanding acknowledgement. Dostoevsky would not advise you to simply cheer up, to think positive thoughts, to distract yourself with activity. These approaches treat depression as an error to be corrected rather than a signal to be understood. Instead, he might counsel dissent. Let yourself go fully into the depression, feel it completely, let it speak to you. This does not mean wallowing or self-pity. It means a kind of active exploration of the depressed state. What images arise when you sit with it? What memories? What regrets? What unlived possibilities? Depression often accompanies the death of something, an identity, a relationship, a dream. Until you grieve what has died, you cannot make space for what might be born. And yet, and this is crucial, depression lies. It tells you that nothing matters, that nothing will ever change, that you are fundamentally defective. These are not truths, they are symptoms. While you explore what the depression has to teach you, you must also maintain some perspective on its distortions. This is where community becomes essential. If you are depressed, you need others who can hold hope on your behalf when you cannot hold it for yourself. You need witnesses who can remind you of who you are when you have forgotten. You need the discipline of continued engagement with life, not because it feels meaningful, but because the feeling of meaninglessness is itself a symptom that will pass. Dostoevsky would remind you that some of the greatest depths are opened by depression. Many who have suffered it report afterward that it fundamentally transformed them, stripping away the superficial, revealing what truly matters, creating a capacity for compassion that they did not possess before. This does not make depression good, but it suggests that it can be redemptive. Grief and loss. If you are grieving for a person who has died, for a relationship that has ended, for a version of yourself that can no longer exist, Dostoevsky offers the wisdom of one who knew grief intimately. He lost his mother when he was young, lost his brother Mikhail in adulthood, lost his first daughter within months of her birth. His novels are saturated with grief. They take it seriously as a dimension of human existence that cannot be bypassed or accelerated. The first thing Dostoevsky would say is, let yourself grieve. In a culture that is uncomfortable with grief, that expects people to move on quickly, that pathologizes prolonged mourning, this is radical advice. Your grief is a measure of your love. To cut it short is to dishonor what you have lost. At the same time, grief must not become frozen. There is a kind of grief that refuses to move, that clings to the past, that makes the lost person or situation into an idol. This grief is not love but a defense against the work of accepting loss. The path through grief involves a strange paradox, holding the reality of what is gone while remaining available to what is still here. Alyosha, after Father Zosima's death, goes through a crisis precisely because he expected his mentor's death to be accompanied by miracles. When the miracle does not come, when the body decays like any other body, Alyosha must revise his understanding. But after his vision of Cana, his mystical experience in the night, he emerges transformed. He still grieves, but his grief is now accompanied by joy. He knows that love is stronger than death, that the dead are not truly gone, that the universe is ultimately on the side of meaning. You do not need to share Dostoevsky's Christian faith to learn from his approach to grief. The essential point is that grief, fully lived, opens into something larger. The person you grieve is not forgotten but integrated. They become part of who you are, part of how you see the world, part of what you carry forward into the future. Chapter 6. The Legacy and Eternal Teaching. Modern Relevance. And now, dear listener, as our journey together approaches its close, let us lift our gaze from the immediate landscape of Dostoevsky's thought to consider its broader vista, its continuing influence, its relevance to our contemporary moment, its capacity to speak across the century and a half that separates us from his death. For Dostoevsky is not a museum piece, an artifact of 19th century thought to be admired from a distance. He is a living voice, perhaps more urgently relevant today than he was in his own time. The conditions he diagnosed, the death of God, the rise of nihilism, the tension between individual freedom and collective security, the strange alliance of rationalism and violence, have only intensified in the decades since his death. Let us consider first his influence on modern psychotherapy. It is no exaggeration to say that Dostoevsky anticipated much of what Sigmund Freud would later systematize. The mechanisms of the unconscious mind, the role of repression in creating symptoms, the ambivalence that characterizes human motivation, the way that early experiences shape adult personality. All of this Dostoevsky understood intuitively, expressing it through narrative rather than theory. Freud himself acknowledged the debt. He called the Brothers Karamazov the most magnificent novel ever written, and devoted a significant essay to the psychology of its author. Where Freud would speak of the Oedipus complex, Dostoevsky had already dramatized the murderous rivalry between fathers and sons. Where Freud would analyze the mechanisms of guilt, Dostoevsky had already traced its workings in Raskolnikov's fevered mind. But Dostoevsky's influence on depth psychology extends beyond Freud. Carl Jung, whom we have mentioned several times in our journey, found in Dostoevsky a kindred explorer of the shadow, the collective unconscious, and the process of individuation. The underground man can be understood as a portrait of the ego in its state of dissociation from the unconscious, clever, controlled, utterly cut off from the sources of authentic life. Alyosha, by contrast, represents the integrated personality, the self that has made peace with its depths. Contemporary therapeutic approaches continue to draw on Dostoevskyan insights. Existential therapy, with its emphasis on freedom, responsibility, and the confrontation with mortality, owes an explicit debt to the tradition of thought that Dostoevsky helped inaugurate. The therapeutic encounter itself, that relationship between therapist and client in which truth is spoken, defenses are gently dissolved, and new possibilities are discovered, resembles nothing so much as the encounters between Dostoevsky's characters, where souls are laid bare and transformation becomes possible. Beyond psychotherapy, Dostoevsky's influence extends into philosophy, particularly the existentialist tradition. Søren Kierkegaard, writing a generation before Dostoevsky, had already begun to articulate the themes of individual existence, the leap of faith, and the priority of subjectivity over objective truth. But it was Dostoevsky who gave these themes their most powerful literary expression, who showed what it looks like to live these questions rather than merely think them. Friedrich Nietzsche, reading Dostoevsky in the 1880s, felt that he had discovered a kindred spirit, someone who understood the depths of human nature, the will to power, the death of God, the necessity of self-overcoming. Dostoevsky, Nietzsche wrote, is the only psychologist from whom I have anything to learn. And yet Dostoevsky pointed in a different direction than Nietzsche. Where Nietzsche saw the death of God as an opportunity for the emergence of the Übermensch, Dostoevsky saw it as a catastrophe that could only be redeemed by a return, not to naive faith, but to a faith that had passed through doubt and emerged deeper. In the 20th century, existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus grappled directly with Dostoevsky's legacy. Camus devoted a significant section of the myth of Sisyphus asterisk to the problem Ivan Karamazov poses. If God does not exist, is everything permitted? Camus answered differently than Dostoevsky. He sought meaning in the absurd revolt against meaninglessness, rather than in religious faith. But he recognized in Dostoevsky the clearest articulation of the problem he was trying to solve. Sartre, too, found in Dostoevsky the themes that would occupy his own work. The burden of freedom, the bad faith by which we flee from our responsibility, the way that our choices define us more fundamentally than any essence we might claim to possess. When Sartre declared that existence precedes essence, he was giving philosophical formulation to what Dostoevsky had dramatized in his novels. But perhaps Dostoevsky's most significant influence has been on modern literature itself. It is impossible to imagine the 20th century novel without him. Franz Kafka, exploring the labyrinthine irrationality of modern bureaucracy and the guilt that haunts us for crimes we cannot name, was clearly working in Dostoevsky's shadow. The protagonist of *The Trial is a descendant of Raskolnikov, guilty before the law, uncertain of his crime, unable to escape the judgment that pursues him. James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and the other pioneers of stream of consciousness narrative owed something to Dostoevsky's pioneering explorations of subjective experience. His willingness to dwell in the turbulent, contradictory flow of thought and feeling that constitutes the inner life. The great Russian writers who followed Dostoevsky, Tolstoy in his late phase, Chekhov, and in the 20th century, Bulgakov, Solzhenitsyn, and others, all worked in relation to his achievement, either extending his concerns or reacting against them. Solzhenitsyn, chronicling the horrors of the Soviet Gulag, was perhaps Dostoevsky's most direct heir, recognizing in the communist experiment exactly what Dostoevsky had predicted: the transformation of utopian ideals into instruments of unprecedented tyranny. And what of our own historical moment? What does Dostoevsky have to say to the inhabitants of the 21st century, with our smartphones and social media, our climate anxieties and political polarizations, our unprecedented material comfort, and our epidemic of loneliness? Consider social media through Dostoevskyan eyes. The platforms that now organize so much of our social existence are, in essence, machines for the cultivation of the persona, that carefully curated self we present to the world. Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, each invites us to construct an image of ourselves and to perform that image for an audience. The gap between persona and shadow, which Dostoevsky explored so thoroughly, has never been wider or more consequential. The underground man would recognize social media instantly. It offers precisely the kind of control over self-presentation that he craved: the ability to compose and edit one's expressions, to craft the perfect image, to avoid the spontaneous revelations that occur in face-to-face encounter. And yet social media also amplifies the underground man's suffering: the constant comparison with others' curated selves, the hunger for validation that is never satisfied, the isolation that deepens even as we accumulate followers and likes. Dostoevsky would see in our social media moment a vast collective experiment in living from the underground. We are all, to some degree, trapped in the same prison of self-consciousness, the same desperate performance of adequacy, the same fear of being truly seen. And he would counsel the same remedy he always counseled: the risk of genuine encounter, the courage to step out of the underground into the vulnerability of real relationship. Consider, too, our contemporary political polarization. We live in an age of ideological intensity, where political identities have become almost tribal in their rigidity. Those on the other side are not merely wrong but evil, not merely mistaken but dangerous. Dialogue across difference has become nearly impossible. We retreat into our echo chambers, our preferred news sources, our communities of the like-minded. Dostoevsky would recognize this dynamic. He saw it in the revolutionary movements of his own time, in the way that abstract ideologies could transform ordinary people into fanatics willing to commit atrocities in the name of the future. His critique of the radicals was not a defense of the status quo. He was deeply critical of czarist autocracy and the inequalities of his society. But he understood that the cure could be worse than the disease, that revolutions undertaken in the name of humanity often ended up destroying human beings. The antidote for Dostoevsky was always the same: attention to the concrete, the particular, the person standing before you. Ideology abstracts, love particularizes. The revolutionary loves humanity in general while despising the actual human beings who fail to live up to the ideal. The truly loving person may have no grand theory of human improvement, but they attend to the specific needs of the specific people in their care. In our age of polarization, this remains essential wisdom. The person across the political divide from you is not a type or a category. They are a human being with a history, with wounds, with hopes and fears not so different from your own. To see them as a person rather than as a representative of an ideology, this is the first step toward the healing of our civic life. Consider also our contemporary relationship with technology and rationality. We live in an age of unprecedented technological power, guided by an implicit faith in the capacity of reason and technology to solve our problems. Climate change will be addressed through carbon capture and renewable energy. Diseases will be conquered through genetic engineering and artificial intelligence. Loneliness will be solved through better apps and virtual reality. Death itself may one day be defeated through the technological transcendence of our biological limitations. Dostoevsky would view these ambitions with the same skepticism he brought to the Crystal Palace. It is not that technology is bad, or that reason is unimportant. The danger lies in the hubris, the assumption that we can engineer our way to paradise, that human suffering is fundamentally a technical problem to be solved rather than a dimension of existence to be faced. The attempt to eliminate all suffering, all uncertainty, all friction from human life is not liberation, but a new kind of slavery. Slavery to the engineers and managers who run the systems on which we depend. The alternative is not to reject technology or reason, but to situate them within a larger vision of human flourishing. What are our technologies for? What kind of life do we want to live? These questions cannot be answered by technology itself. They require wisdom of the kind that Dostoevsky spent his life cultivating, wisdom about the depths of human nature, about what makes life meaningful, about the limits of what can be achieved through manipulation and control. The critics and controversies. In our journey through Dostoevsky's thought, dear listener, we have dwelt mainly in appreciation. But intellectual honesty requires that we also acknowledge the criticisms that have been leveled against him, the ways in which his vision may be limited, the places where his biases show, the questions he perhaps answered too quickly or not at all. The most common criticism concerns his treatment of rationality and the West. Dostoevsky's contempt for Western liberalism, his dismissal of rationalist philosophy, his caricatures of socialists and atheists. These can strike the modern reader as unfair, as if he was attacking straw men rather than the most sophisticated versions of the positions he opposed. Ivan Karamazov's atheism is philosophically powerful, but some critics suggest that Dostoevsky does not give it its due, that the novel stacks the deck in favor of faith by associating atheism with moral collapse and murder. There is something to this criticism. Dostoevsky was a polemicist as well as a novelist, and he sometimes allowed his political and religious agenda to override his commitment to letting all sides speak. His villains, Pyotr Verkovensky, Smerdyakov, are often less fully human than his heroes, more like demonstrations of a thesis than living people. And yet, one might respond that Dostoevsky's critique was not of reason itself, but of a particular ideology of reason, the belief that human beings could be reduced to their rational interests, that a scientific understanding of society could replace the need for faith and community. That progress was inevitable, and moral improvement would follow technological improvement. This ideology has been repeatedly discredited by history, from the terrors of the French Revolution through the catastrophes of the 20th century. In this sense, Dostoevsky was not attacking reason but a particular misuse of reason, a rationalism that had forgotten its own limits. A second criticism concerns Dostoevsky's treatment of women. While he created some memorable female characters, Sonya, Grushenka, Nastasia Filipovna, critics have pointed out that these women are often defined primarily through their relationships with men, their roles in the spiritual dramas of male protagonists. The women suffer. The men are transformed by their suffering. The women embody compassion. The men wrestle with the great philosophical questions. This criticism has force. Dostoevsky was a man of his time, and his time was not notable for its enlightened views on gender. He could not fully imagine female interiority in the way he imagined male interiority, and his novels reflect this limitation. The rich psychological portraiture that makes Raskolnikov or Ivan so compelling is rarely extended to the female characters. And yet one might also note that the qualities Dostoevsky most valued, compassion, self-sacrifice, the capacity to love despite suffering, were precisely the qualities he associated with his female characters. If the men have the philosophical arguments, the women have the wisdom. If the men debate, the women love. In Dostoevsky's hierarchy of values, this means that the women are actually closer to the truth. They embody what the men are struggling to understand. This does not excuse the limitation of his characterization, but it complicates the criticism. A third and more troubling criticism concerns Dostoevsky's nationalism and his attitudes toward non-Russian peoples. His late essays, particularly, contain passages of virulent anti-Semitism and Russian chauvinism that are painful to read. He believed that the Russian people had a special spiritual mission, that Russian Orthodox Christianity was the true faith, that the West was spiritually decadent and Jews were agents of corruption. These views are indefensible. How are we to relate to a thinker whose wisdom we admire but whose prejudices we find repugnant? This is a question we must ask about many figures from the past, and there is no easy answer. What we can say is that the value of Dostoevsky's psychological and spiritual insights does not depend on the validity of his political opinions. We can learn from him about the underground of the human psyche without accepting his views on Russia's geopolitical mission. We can appreciate his understanding of suffering and redemption without endorsing his nationalism. Moreover, the spirit of Dostoevsky's best work actually contradicts his worst prejudices. The Dostoevsky who insisted on the infinite value of every human person, who counseled against judging others, who warned of the dangers of abstract ideology. This Dostoevsky provides the resources for criticizing the prejudices of the biographical Dostoevsky. The author was not equal to his own insights. This does not invalidate the insights. It confirms their difficulty. A final criticism concerns the specifically religious dimension of Dostoevsky's thought. For readers who do not share his Christian faith, his answers may seem to beg the question. If the meaning of suffering depends on the existence of a loving God, what about those who cannot believe in such a God? If redemption requires grace, what about those who experience no grace? Dostoevsky was aware of this problem. Ivan Karamazov voices the objection more powerfully than any atheist philosopher could. Even if God exists, a God who permits the torture of innocent children does not deserve our allegiance. And Dostoevsky, significantly, does not directly answer Ivan's argument. He answers it indirectly, through the figure of Alyosha and the example of Father Zosima, through life, not logic. This may not satisfy those who want intellectual proof, but perhaps it points to a truth that transcends the religious-secular divide. Whatever we believe about ultimate reality, we must still decide how to live. And on this question, how to live with suffering, how to find meaning, how to love in a broken world, Dostoevsky's wisdom remains available even to those who cannot share his theology. The practices he commends, honest self-examination, active love, acceptance of suffering as a dimension of existence, humble service to others, are practices that do not require any particular metaphysical belief. They require only a commitment to living fully, truly, humanly. The final choice. And so, dear listener, we come to the crossroads where Dostoevsky's wisdom meets your own life. For all the knowledge we have explored together, all the concepts and insights and practices, there remains an irreducible element that cannot be taught, only chosen. Dostoevsky presents you with a choice, the same choice that faced Raskolnikov and Ivan, the same choice that faces every person who has truly understood the human condition. On one side lies the path of the underground, the retreat into consciousness, the maintenance of the persona, the avoidance of genuine encounter, the comfortable numbness that passes for security. This path has its attractions. It offers control, or the illusion of control. It protects us from the vulnerability of love. It keeps the chaos at bay, or seems to. On the other side lies the path of descent and resurrection, the willingness to face the shadow, to endure the crisis of meaning, to risk the exposure of authentic connection. This path is more dangerous. There are no guarantees. You may descend into the underground and find no bottom. You may reach for grace and find only silence. And yet Dostoevsky would say, this path is the only one that leads anywhere real. The path of the underground leads only in circles, the endless repetition of the same defenses, the same strategies, the same failures. It is a kind of death in life, the perpetual postponement of authentic existence. However risky the path of descent, it at least offers the possibility of genuine transformation. What might it look like to choose this harder path? It looks like admitting what you have been hiding from yourself most of all. It looks like allowing yourself to be seen, in your imperfection and your longing, by another person. It looks like loving without the certainty of return, hoping without the guarantee of fulfillment, acting without knowing the outcome. It looks like accepting your freedom, really accepting it, not as an abstract principle but as the defining fact of your existence. You are responsible. No one else will live your life for you. No system or ideology or therapeutic technique can relieve you of the weight of your own choices. This is terrifying. It is also the foundation of dignity. It looks like making peace with suffering, not seeking it out, not wallowing in it, but accepting it as an inevitable dimension of a life lived fully. The person who avoids all suffering avoids life itself. The person who meets suffering openly, who allows it to work its strange alchemy, discovers a depth and a richness that those who flee from pain never know. It looks like love, not the sentimental love of greeting cards, but the active love that Father Zosima described. The love that is a discipline, a practice, a way of being present to others in their need. The love that does not ask what it will receive but only what it can give. This love is not a feeling that happens to you. It is a commitment you enact day by day in the concrete circumstances of your life. And perhaps most mysteriously, it looks like faith, not necessarily religious faith, but the deeper faith that despite all appearances, existence is not meaningless, that your efforts matter, even when you cannot see their effects. That love, though it may seem to be defeated, is never truly defeated, that the seeds you plant may flower long after you are gone, in ways you cannot imagine. This faith is not certainty. It is not the opposite of doubt, but its companion. The person of genuine faith has passed through doubt, has felt the ground give way beneath them, has known the vertigo of meaninglessness. They have come out the other side, not with answers but with something more sustaining, a willingness to live the questions, to trust the process, to keep moving forward even when the destination is obscure. Dostoevsky knew that this choice is not made once and for all. It is made daily, sometimes hourly, in the small decisions that constitute a life. Every moment presents the choice again: retreat into the underground or step forward into the light, defend and protect or open and risk. Each choice shapes the next. Until a life takes form, a character is revealed, a destiny is fulfilled or betrayed. You, listening tonight, are in the midst of this choosing. Perhaps you are at a crisis point where the choice seems stark and urgent. Perhaps you are in a quieter period where the choice expresses itself in subtle shades and small decisions. Either way, the choice is yours. No one can make it for you. And yet, dear listener, Dostoevsky would not leave you with only the weight of this responsibility. Alongside the burden, there is grace. Alongside the demand, there is gift. The very fact that you are here, attending to these questions, engaging with this wisdom, suggests that something in you has already chosen to seek, to question, to grow. This seeking is itself a form of answer. Your restlessness is a sign of life. Remember that you do not walk this path alone. The wisdom we have explored tonight is not a set of techniques to be mastered, but a companionship to be received. Dostoevsky himself walks with you, as do all the others across the centuries who have grappled with the same questions, faced the same fears, sought the same light. You are part of a vast community of seekers, most of them invisible to you, all of them struggling as you struggle, hoping as you hope. And remember, too, that the path is not a straight line. There will be setbacks, regressions, times when you seem to have lost everything you gained. This is not failure, it is the rhythm of growth. The spiral path descends into the depths again and again, but each time, if you attend closely, you will find that the depths are less frightening, the ascent less arduous. What once seemed impossible becomes difficult. What was difficult becomes challenging. What was challenging becomes simply your life. Dostoevsky's central insight, to which we have returned throughout this journey, is perhaps simply this: that you are deeper than you know, that you contain more than you imagine, that even in your darkest moments, something in you remains untouched by the darkness, a seed of light that cannot be extinguished, a capacity for love that no suffering can destroy. Call it the image of God, call it the true self, call it the ground of being. The name matters less than the recognition. There is something in you that cannot be conquered, that remains available even when everything else has been stripped away. This is the faith that sustained Dostoevsky through imprisonment and exile, through poverty and illness, through the deaths of those he loved, through the long struggle to bring his vision into words. And it is the faith he offers to you now, as you drift towards sleep, as the weight of the day lifts from your shoulders, as the questions and insights and challenges of our exploration together settle like snow into the landscape of your psyche. You are not the sum of your achievements or your failures. You are not the story others tell about you, or even the story you tell about yourself. You are the one who underlies all the stories, the consciousness in which all experiences arise and pass away, the silent witness that has been with you since the beginning and will be with you to the end. You are deeper than your wounds, larger than your problems, more mysterious than any theory can capture. And this you, this deep, mysterious, irreducible you, is the one that Dostoevsky addresses, across the century and a half that separates his hand from your ear. He speaks to the you that is capable of growth, of transformation, of love. He speaks to the you that already knows, in some half-remembered way, the truths he is pointing toward. He speaks to awaken what is already present but sleeping, to remind you of what you have always known but forgotten. As you drift toward sleep tonight, carry with you the image of Alyosha Karamazov, standing among the schoolboys after Ilyusha's funeral. Remember his words: "Let us never forget this moment, and let us keep in our hearts a good memory." A good memory, especially one from our childhood, may be the best education of all. And if a man carries many such memories with him into life, he is safe to the end of his days. And even if only one good memory is left in our hearts, it may also be the instrument of our salvation one day. You have many such memories, dear listener. They are scattered through your life like seeds, waiting to flower. Some of them you have forgotten, but they are still there, working their quiet influence on who you are becoming. Tonight, perhaps, you are planting another such memory, the memory of this encounter with Dostoevsky's wisdom, this time set apart for reflection and growth. Let this memory be a seed. Let it fall into the depths of your being, into the dark, fertile soil where transformation happens in secret. You do not need to understand it fully. You do not need to apply it immediately. Let it work in its own time, in its own way. Trust the process. And when you wake tomorrow, let something of tonight remain with you. Perhaps a phrase will surface in your mind, a question, an image. Follow it. See where it leads. The wisdom we have explored is not meant to be memorized, but to be lived. It will meet you in the specific circumstances of your life, in the relationships and challenges and choices that await you. It will be there when you need it. Dostoevsky's last novel ended with the word resurrection. He believed, with all the passion of his tormented, seeking soul, that even the most broken life can be renewed, that even the deepest despair can open into hope, that the final word is not death but life. Whether or not you share his faith in its specifically Christian form, You can share his confidence in the possibility of transformation. You have seen enough to know that people change, that hearts soften, that light can enter the darkest places. This transformation awaits you too, not as something to be achieved through effort alone, but as something to be received, to be allowed, to be surrendered to. The wisdom of the underground leads to the wisdom of emergence. The path through the shadow leads to integration. The confrontation with suffering leads to compassion. The acceptance of freedom leads to authentic life. And all of this is available to you, dear listener, not in some distant future, but here, now, in this very breath, this very moment. The transformation Dostoevsky described is not an event that happens once, but a way of being that can characterize every moment. To be awake, to be present, to be open to what is. This is the essence of the wisdom we have explored. Rest now. Let the ideas settle. Let the questions gestate. Let your busy mind grow quiet, your vigilant heart grow soft. You have traveled far tonight through depths and heights, through shadows and light. You deserve rest. You have earned sleep. Tomorrow you will wake to the same world, the same life, the same challenges. But perhaps something will be different. Perhaps you will see with slightly different eyes, respond with a slightly more open heart. Perhaps the teachings of Dostoevsky will weave themselves, invisibly, into the texture of your day. And perhaps in some quiet moment, waiting at a traffic light, washing dishes, lying awake before dawn, the questions will return. Who am I beneath the masks? What is this life asking of me? How can I love more truly, suffer more consciously, live more fully? These questions have no final answers. They are meant to be lived, not solved. But in the living, something is born, a quality of presence, a depth of understanding, a capacity for grace that is its own answer. This is what Dostoevsky achieved in his turbulent, suffering, magnificent life. This is what he offers to you. Sleep well, dear listener. Sleep deeply and peacefully, knowing that the wisdom of the ages is with you, that the struggles and triumphs of those who came before have made your path a little easier, that you are held in a web of meaning larger than you can imagine. Sleep, and when you wake, carry forward this gift. Let it transform you, and through you, the world. Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky died on February 9, 1881 in St. Petersburg. 30,000 people followed his coffin to the Alexander Nevsky Monastery. His gravestone bears the words from the Gospel of John that he had chosen as the epigraph to the Brothers Karamazov. Except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. He had fallen into the ground. And from his death, so much fruit has come. The novels that continue to transform readers, the insights that continue to illuminate the human condition, the witness that suffering, truly faced, can be the gateway to wisdom and love. Tonight, you have received something of that fruit. Tomorrow, and in the days to come, you may choose to plant it in your own life, in the soil of your own experience. What grows from that planting is yours to discover. The story never ends. The journey never concludes. The questions remain open and the answers keep deepening. This is the gift of a truly human life, not arrival but travel, not possession but seeking, not answers but ever more profound questions. Rest now in the mystery. Sleep in peace. And when you wake, remember, you carry within you everything you need for the journey ahead. Good night.